Pandemonium reigns as drones from across the city swarm toward a towering structure hovering in the sky. Piercing screams echo from within. The tower is a true bastion of malevolence. A colossal dragon obliterates all in its path. Drones report the last human, Luras, has fallen. The team is annihilated. Stage 17 is a failure. The dragon's health remains at 94%. The team that advanced on the dragon with grins and unwavering confidence now lies dead amid the tower's rubble. Spectators, watching the battle, are stunned. None can fathom that Sword Lord Luras is gone, the mightiest team crushed. People question who could slay the dragon when the strongest only reduced its health by 5%. A global alert warns that the boss must be defeated before the deadline. Only 32 minutes remain. Failure means the exam area's population will be eradicated. The exam area is the solar system. Crowds stand in streets, praying the world won't end. Some propose a mass assault on the dragon. Others, in despair, spend their last coins on a final feast. Some simply weep, helpless and unwilling to die. Abruptly, drones declared a new participant had entered. Hope flickered. Perhaps a team hadn't surrendered, offering a chance for survival. But the drones reported only one contender, number 128, Rayendo, who stepped through the portal into the fiery abode. After witnessing the carnage, people's hopes crumbled. Convinced no one could face the dragon alone, they turned to bid farewell to loved ones, bracing for the world's end. Some believed the boy was simply seeking a dramatic suicide. The dragon mocked Ray for coming alone. It taunted that if Ray didn't resist, it would grant him a full 3 minutes to live. Ray smirked, thanking the dragon for its advice and calling it a coward. He warned that the more it spoke, the longer he'd survive. His grin widened, eyes tearing up as he teased the dragon's concern for his life. Enraged, the boss of the fiery abode roared. The dragon sneered, claiming the kid was hastening his own demise. Drones broadcasted alerts. The dragon unleashed a square attack and blazing dragon flames. Yet Ray remained unfazed by the brilliant flames before him. With a hand behind his back, he snapped his fingers, conjuring a magic orb. Ray struck first. The dragon, livid, couldn't fathom how the boy had parried its attack. Ray grinned, declaring he hadn't come unprepared and was ready for combat. He launched his assault, redirecting the dragon's strike against it. A green stream from his orb morphed into a dragon, biting into its belly. The system announced the dragon's health dropped to 84%. Blood seeped from its wound, and Ray mused if the mighty dragon's skill only inflicted 10% damage. Disappointed, he extended his hand, lamenting he'd overprepared, as even the audience might lose interest after this. The dragon, slightly recovered, tried to speak, but Ray cut it off, revealing a crystal wrapped in a chain. Smiling, he shattered the crystal into pieces, revealing a small skull within. He warned the dragon it shouldn't have spoken. The system reported Ray had deployed a unique item, a soul shackle. A crystal fragment materialized above the dragon. Chained on all sides, the dragon panicked, unsure how to react. It was dragged to the ground, bound tightly, roaring in fury. Ray raised his hand, siphoning energy, commanding the dragon to be silent. Drones displayed the battered, bleeding dragon to the crowd, then panned to a sign. It listed Ray's name and payment transfer details. Another drone approached, reporting 22 minutes and 52 seconds remained. Ray, in no rush to slay the dragon, declared he'd wait 2 more minutes. Seizing a drone, he told the audience to pay up if they wanted the dragon dead. Relaxing, he sat and spoke to the camera, asking viewers what they thought their lives were worth. The crowd, furious, shouted for Ray to finish it, with the world at stake. They called him insane, insisting money didn't matter now. Ray calmly poured tea. The dragon, enraged, roared that the boy would pay for his mockery. With a snap of his fingers, Ray tightened the dragon's chains. The system announced the dragon had unleashed its absolute skill, Flame of Great Fury. A torrent of brilliant flame surged at Ray, but he didn't flinch, sipping his tea. The dragon's fury grew. Ray set his cup down, chiding the dragon for learning nothing. Locking eyes with it, he asked if he hadn't warned it to stay quiet, or it wouldn't see the payment sign on his account. The dragon, stunned, couldn't believe its absolute skill failed against this boy. Meanwhile, Ray checked his account, shocked to see only 10 billion transferred. He asked if they were mocking him. Leaning back, he mused that he couldn't do the job properly for such a sum. Looking at the camera, Ray bid everyone farewell. City screens cut the broadcast, displaying an error. Panic swept through the crowd, baffled by Ray's broadcast cutoff. Some didn't grasp that he truly demanded all their savings. A woman collapsed, clutching her child, pleading for the world's savior to ensure their survival. Meanwhile, elites grew anxious over Ray's demand for the full sum, fearing massive future losses. The boss yelled, silencing them. Future concerns could wait. For now, they'd be his sponsors. He ordered all funds transferred to Ray. The money finally reached him. Ray, elated, declared he'd gotten what he wanted, now the world's richest man. He activated the Soul Smith's side skill, announcing it was time to save the world. Ray snapped his fingers, retrieving vials containing a dragon's soul, a god's soul, and a mage soul. The system announced the formation of special gear, the holy sword of the great artisan. The dragon burst into laughter, mocking Ray's toothpick as a means to defeat him. Breaking free from the chains, the dragon roared that he'd crush Ray with his own claws. But before it could finish, Ray severed its paw, and the dragon crashed to the ground. Ray advanced on the dragon, landing several strikes, decapitating it and slicing its body apart. Finished, he swung his sword, declaring the dragon's demise was inevitable. Wiping blood from his face and blade, Ray noted that the moment had come when a hefty sum hit his account. But how had Ray reached this point? Not long ago, it was a sunny day, a gentle breeze drifting through a small room. Ray was immersed in a virtual reality game, sweating with exhilaration. A system notification flashed. Ray had passed the final trial. Exhausted, he dropped to one knee, grinning in disbelief, asking if he'd truly done it. It was called a scam game, a fully immersive online prophecy game with stunning VR world building. Boasting 16K resolution, the action game let players experience sounds, smells, and objects through VR devices. Those who reached the end would gain unlimited resources, enduring for centuries. Yet no one trusted the game's claims. Ray, like others, played for fun, hoping any reward would hit his account. But everything changed one day. Ray recalled working at a construction site when the foreman called for a break. He sat on a bench under an awning, escaping the heat, overhearing other workers chatter. Unable to land a steady job, Ray took part-time labor gigs at construction sites. He toiled under the sun until drenched, enduring mockery and scorn from colleagues. As Ray opened his food container for a bite, his phone pinged with a message from the online prophecy game. Puzzled, he wondered how the developer's notification got through. He disabled all alerts. The message hailed Ray as the top prophecy player online, congratulating him for ranking first in power among beta testers. It mentioned a reward transfer to his account, pending confirmation. Ray twisted open his water bottle, chuckling if they'd gone mad. He decided to check. Logging into his account, while sipping water, he remarked his account was empty anyway. Then he froze mid-sentence. Staring at the massive sum in his account, Ray was dumbfounded. As he gaped at his phone, a worker called out, wanting to ask something. Getting no reply, the worker approached, slapped Ray's shoulder, and asked if he was okay or overheating. Ray sprang from his seat, shoving the worker aside, and bolted from the construction site. The worker yelled after him, asking where he was headed. Ecstatic, Ray raced home, incredulous that the game could actually yield real money. If the promise of unlimited, everlasting resources was true, he'd pour all his energy into it. But Ray soon realized his naivety. The game was merciless to its players. Players were mere pawns. Level bosses obliterated not just players, but their saves too. Dungeon exits appeared in random locations. Worst of all, the pain from attacks felt painfully real. Faced with a visceral fear of death, many players quit. Ray's job barely covered essentials. To keep playing, he sank into debt and loans. Creditors hounded him, threatening death if he didn't repay. With no other option, Ray pressed on, clinging to the hope of endless resources. After completing the game, another message from the developer arrived, congratulating him on his success. It claimed the experience Ray gained would prove invaluable in the future. Ray exhaled, removing the VR device and setting it down with shaky hands. Smiling, he said he'd actually done it. A notification pinged, and Ray rushed to his phone, finding another email from the developer. Addressed to all Prophecy Online players, it stated they'd recently achieved their goal. Someone had completed the game. As a result, all Prophecy Online servers would shut down immediately. Ray, panicked, asked what about his reward. The message's final line thanked players sincerely for participating. No mention of a reward. Stunned, Ray dropped his phone, cracking the screen. Head bowed, he muttered again about his reward. He'd endured every grueling trial to finish the game. They owed him. Calming himself, Ray reasoned the sum was so large it couldn't transfer at once. He lay on his mattress, hopeful, planning to check his account tomorrow. But since his first million, no more money arrived. He kept imagining how much better life would have been if he'd quit midway. Regret was useless. Time couldn't rewind. A week later, Ray woke on a sweltering morning to a notification. Ray grabbed his phone, confirming no one was calling. Glancing up, he saw a screen flashing before him. It displayed, Main Quest failed. Moscow destroyed. New Main Quest, Land Trial begins. Time remaining, 43 days, 7 hours. Defeat the boss before the deadline, or the exam area will be annihilated. Ray, bewildered, couldn't grasp what was happening. News blared on TV. Moscow had been erased from existence. The entire city was obliterated. Russia's government declared no survivors. Unidentified creatures emerged in Japan. Cities faced attacks from dragon-like beings. Reporters warned that the terror that struck Moscow now loomed over Japan. Eyewitnesses claimed the catastrophe mirrored a quest in a game called Prophecy Online, with near-identical details. https://www.umpnews.com/news/world/Ukraine. Launches drone attack. Moscow, shutting airports. Urkna, 179485. A geologist on TV dismissed it as nonsense, insisting it wasn't a game, but a natural disaster from tectonic plate shifts. The host countered, citing their field reporters' footage. The geologist insisted it was camera distortion, not monsters. Meanwhile, Japanese media scrambled to evade a monster. A reporter, trembling, asked if they were safe as a creature targeted them. Suddenly, a co-worker began shouting through the device for them to get out of there immediately as the monster opened its mouth and gathered a huge amount of energy into itself. However, there was no response from the reporter and the entire team. The monster destroyed their helicopter and communication was lost. Ray realized then that it wasn't the slabs at all. There was no doubt about it. It had happened. Even though the world was completely screwed when the game became a reality, Ray was completely calm. For he had only one thought in his mind at the time, about the experience he had gained, for it must surely become a valuable resource in the future. These resources in question implied strategies for getting through the game, and Ray was the only one who had made it to the end, and saving the world was in his hands. And with this unrivaled power, Ray could make a huge pile of money. As the online prophecy became a reality, Ray realized that a race for points would now begin among the former players, and one should quickly run to the nearest dungeon. With the apocalypse coming, the atmosphere on the streets became gloomy. Running past people, Ray heard that people didn't know what to do or where to run to. Some still didn't believe that Japan was over. No transportation in the city was running. Ray was getting tired of running and gritted his teeth, overcoming his fatigue. But suddenly a familiar voice stopped the guy. It was Takuo from the debt collectors who were harassing the guy because of his debts. Takuo ordered the guy to stop and asked him how come Ray goes for a walk and doesn't return money. Takuo was just on his way to visit the guy, so he told the guy to turn around and go with him. After saying that, he threw the cigarette but in the guy's face. A year ago, when Ray was in the game, he received an email stating that an online prophecy company was offering interest-free $200,000 to those who would qualify. And the condition is that players who get unlimited resources commit to giving half to the company. Ray was tempted and thought that it was $200,000 without interest, and he could pay it back later when he had completed the game. The guy agreed and took the loan. But of course, it didn't work out that way. They did give him $200,000, but then, when Ray had already spent it, they sent him a contract with exorbitant interest rates. According to them, Ray didn't qualify, so they demanded 50% in 10 days. So the guy had to get into several loans in order to pay on time. However, when Ray was ready to pay everything on time, they did not answer the phone. They waited for the interest to rise. In the meantime, Takuo told the boy that it was time to pay off his debts. Ray glared at him menacingly and said that they hadn't given him a chance to return the money on time. Had they? Takuo called the guy pathetic and said that all debtors usually say stupid excuses like that. Suddenly, Takuo quieted his fervor and said that wasn't why he was here. He asked the guy if he had played the prophecy online. After all, the world was about to be overrun with something that looked like this game. Takuo grabbed the guy by the shirt and demanded that Ray tell him everything he knew. Suddenly, Ray ordered Takuo to put his hands away. This made the collector very angry, and he didn't understand why Ray was being such a bully. The guy looked him in the eyes and said he could give him one good advice. After that, Ray activated the beginner's fist skill, and when Takuo saw the guy's hand glowing blue, he let go in fear. The system reported that the impact force had been increased by 50%. That's when Ray struck the collector. He fell to the floor instantly. Ray walked over to him and deactivated the skill, telling him that he would be in charge in this world. Takuo remained silent, and then Ray said he didn't seem to hear him anymore. Then Ray left him sitting there unconscious and ran on. People who were passing by in a car were interested in the sight. A hooded guy named Light looked out the window and asked the girl sitting next to him, named Ree, if that was a participant in the game there. Light smirked and said he didn't think he'd meet the initiates so soon. The hooded guy knew that soon all laws would become nothing. The entire foundation of the world would be rewritten. The situation was becoming more and more curious to him. It wasn't long before Ray arrived at the goat's sanctuary. He approached the huge doors. There was no doubt in his mind. This place was exactly the same as in the game. As he got closer, he stopped and noticed some strange car parked on the road nearby. So, there was someone inside already? Ray entered the sanctuary, and a long way down appeared in front of him. He'd been going down for several minutes. As he approached the doors of the first hallway, Ray realized something was wrong. It smelled like blood. The boy covered his nose and entered. There he saw a pile of humanoid-looking lizard corpses. Someone had obviously killed them. In the very center of the hall stood the team and its leader, Light. He spotted Ray and told the others that another one had arrived. Light put both hands on the hilt of the sword he stuck into the monster and asked Ray if he was also a player since he had come to this place. Ray was clearly unhappy that he wasn't alone there and asked if they had killed the lizards. Light replied that it was their doing, and these high-level monsters are called shining lizards. And if it weren't for their team, Ray would be dead by now. At this time, Ray thought to himself, what kind of high-level lizards are these? After all, they're the lowest in rank. Suddenly, Light took off his hood and offered Ray to be his subordinate, as he noticed that Ray had come alone and had no friends. The condition was that Ray would give him half of the rewards, and Light would in turn protect him as weak. Ray smiled as he closed his eyes and apologized, saying that he preferred to play alone. He then pointed his finger at their entire team and said with a smile that other than that they didn't stand a chance against the level boss. Light's face darkened with annoyance, and the others were surprised at such words. The entire team gathered behind the pillars for a discussion. It was suggested to kill Ray after they dealt with the boss. The Ree girl disagreed, as it was too cruel. Light said that all the remaining players are just obstacles in their way, and the less people know about the game, the better for them. He confronted the boys and said that this was his decision, and all those who disagreed would die from an accident. Light then told the team that the level boss is a flaming goat, a rather challenging opponent. But once defeated, it recovers in a full 7 days. Light didn't want Ray to get the loot from the boss either, so he told his team not to let Ray go inside until he defeated the boss. There were 5 minutes left until the gate opened. It wouldn't be long before they could enter and fight the boss. Several of the team members approached Ray, who was standing away from everyone. Ray grinned at them and asked if they had decided to fight him. The guy clenched his hands into a fist and said he did, ordering Ray not to move from his spot. Ray realized he could have unwound them in a second, but he didn't even want to get his hands dirty. So he decided for himself that he would have time to kill the boss when their entire team lost. There were 3 seconds until the door opened. The doors opened and the team went inside. Ray stayed outside and leaned against the wall, sipping his tea. He wondered how far they could go. Light, meanwhile, asked worriedly if Ray had gone after them. When he was sure he'd stayed there, Light said it was better for them. And suddenly the girl asked what would happen if anyone guessed that they had presented Ray's death as an accident. Light replied that she was thinking too much. During this conversation, they had almost reached the end of the spacious corridor. The Light hit the boy's shield and told him to be on guard. The guy gave him a thumbs up with a smile and told him that everything would be fine since he had this shield and no bosses would be afraid of them. Suddenly, a strong torrent of wind blew through the hallway, and Light started screaming, "What the hell is going on, and where is this wind coming from?" At the end of the corridor, a huge pillar burst into flames with a strong wind coming from it. Light froze in one place and looked with horror at the flames. He thought it was the boss. However, the flames died down. Suddenly, the clatter of 4-hoofed monsters was heard. A huge centaur with a hammer in its hands appeared. It was an infernal goat. The hell goat opened its mouth, where flames were coming from, and roared violently. All the team members found themselves scattered in different directions. A loud roar and a mighty torrent of wind made them fly even farther. Some were thrown right back to the doors, and Light was among them. The guy looked at the hell goat one more time and realized that this was all very, very, very bad. He didn't understand how they should proceed. A frightened girl ran up to him and asked him what they should do. The Light told her to be quiet and said that they would retreat now. One of the team members rushed to the doors, but the doors would not budge in any way. They could not be opened. Suddenly, the shield guy appeared and asked what the hell they were doing. Light told the rest of the team to hold the shield guy back, because he said his shield could withstand anything. And so there was nothing left for the guy to do but try to protect everyone. He stood up to the infernal goat with dignity. The team ran to the door to try to open it and escape, and meanwhile the goat raised his hammer and destroyed the guy with one blow. Shrapnel went flying in all directions. Hearing the rumble, the team turned around. Their faces froze with horror when they saw the crushed body of their comrade. After that, the hell goat took the guy's shield with 2 fingers, raised it above his head, and swallowed it. The team members were horrified by what they saw. None of them had realized how terrible the monster was. Light knew that this shouldn't have happened. Since they were preparing to face the fire goat, this monster could be defeated even by beginners knowing the strategy. But after the new version, there was a boss that no one had ever defeated. It was the hell goat. 4,762 players failed at killing this boss. Light didn't understand why this hellcat was here, why he hadn't been removed, because he shouldn't be here. And then Light remembered that Ray was standing outside. And even though the door couldn't be opened from the inside, it was possible to enter from the outside. Light leaned against the door and started knocking and yelling for Ray to open the door. He promised to give him all the team's awards if Ray defeated this monster. Light didn't hear anything in response. He kept knocking and yelling, hoping that Ray would open the door. However, while Light was trying to shout, the monster was already at the door. The goat scattered everyone in different directions with a hammer. The team members fell to the floor and wheezed in pain. Light tried to get to his feet after the blow. He realized that the goat was too strong, and at this rate they would all die. At that moment, Ray opened the doors and stepped inside, saying that it was so unbecoming of a leader to ask others for help. Light squirming in pain, looked up at Ray's narcissistic smile and gritted his teeth. However, Light reassured himself that he was only using Ray as bait to save his ass. So he stood up and ordered all the team members to head for the exit while Ray distracted the monster. And when the girl ran past Ray, he tripped her. She fell to the floor, and Ray told her that he didn't advise her to do that. Meanwhile, Light was running as fast as he could toward the door, but it had already begun to close. He reached forward, thinking he was about to be on the other side of the door. However, the door closed right in his face and clamped his arm. Light grimaced in pain and screamed, trying to pull his arm out. Hearing the scream, the Hellcat came up to him and told him he was very noisy. The Light immediately went silent. The monster raised his hammer and irritatedly began shouting that these cries were making his ears ache, so let him finally shut up. Light looked at the monster with horror, and cold sweat appeared on his face. After that, there was a loud sound. A thump was heard. Light's body was crushed, and blood splattered around. The team members were now at a loss as to what to do next. At this time, Ray picked up Light's sword and said that it was very simple. And even though Light was a jerk, his sword wasn't bad. Suddenly the Hellcat raised his hammer over the guy and laughingly asked if he wanted to die too, promising that he would help with that. After that, the monster struck the place where Ray was with the hammer. However, the guy was already above his head at that time. Ray smirked and told the goat that he was talking some nonsense. And after saying that, the guy cut off the monster's horns. And then, moving down the goat's body, Ray began to deliver slashing blows. The monster shrieked loudly, and its horns clattered to the ground. At that time, Ray found himself standing next to the surviving crew members. He told them that he could save their lives for only 10 million. The girl was in complete shock and couldn't believe her ears. Ray had told them again that for 10 million they would be saved. The girl decided to clarify whether it was 10 million each. Ray replied that that was correct, 10 million each for keeping them alive. And then the guy jumped up and started yelling for Ray to stop talking heresy, since they don't have that much money and it's too much. Then Ray pointed his sword at them and said that if they had no money, then let them earn it by their own labor. And they would give him 90% of the bounty on every boss they defeated. Ray thought about asking for full payment, but decided they could keep the 10%. He wasn't a despot. The girl started shouting for Ray to cut the bullshit, as even Light Sand was only demanding 50% of the loot from them. Immediately after those words, the monster shadow covered them and a torrent of flames erupted. The infernal goat screamed. How dare he rob him of his pride, his horns? After that, the monster released a fireball at the guys, and they didn't even have a chance to leave the line of fire. The girl immediately pulled out her staff and shielded everyone, but it wasn't enough. And Ray shoved them back so the fire wouldn't reach them. After that, Ray landed next to them and asked how long would their luck last for them to survive. And then the girl along with the guy fell to their knees and started screaming that they would agree to anything as long as Ray would kill that hellish asshole. Hearing that answer, Ray smiled and said that was the end of it. Then he turned around and looked at the monster. He yelled to the goat that somehow it had been a long time since he had kicked his ass. This made the monster very angry, and he replied that he didn't remember losing to a mortal. The team members, meanwhile, couldn't understand what Ray was even carrying, since with the new update of the Hell Goat, no player had ever managed to defeat him. Ray looked at the monster confidently and remembered that there was no update related to this boss in this game. After his victory over the Hell Goat, he changed his form and players could only fight against the Fire Goat. While Ray was thinking, the monster attacked him, but Ray reacted instantly and prevented the blow. Trump got incredibly angry and started asking who Ray even was and how he was able to parry his hammer. Ray smiled and replied that with such an attack, even a level 50 veteran player would meet his death, and for him, such a blow would be fatal. But as long as Ray knows the goat's weak spot, the monster won't kill him. The Hell Goat swung his hammer in fury, and Ray slipped away from the blow. He then began to dodge each of the monster's blows, moving from side to side. The infernal goat became enraged and started screaming in rage as to why he couldn't even hit this mortal. At this time, Ray approached the monster's head and slit its eye, saying that it moved the same way it did in their last battle. Ray didn't stop and kept throwing punches. The team members watched this battle and couldn't believe that Ray was winning. The guy and girl clenched their fists and started shouting words of encouragement for Ray to take this asshole down. Ray started yelling for them to shut up and not distract him. The crew members called him a rude person in response. Meanwhile, Ray landed on the ground and the goat's hammer hit almost right next to him. After that, the goat struck again. Ray managed to slip away from the blows. However, he found himself trapped in the corner of the wall with nowhere to run. Trump smiled and put the hammer on the floor, saying Ray might say something before he died. But Ray sent the goat far away and said it wouldn't hit him even at such a small distance. Fury engulfed the goat. His eyes glowed with flames. He raised his head and opened his mouth wide, gathering the hot flames within. The fire began to spread throughout the room. The team members couldn't understand what was happening. It was a flame that destroyed everything in its path. Even level 99 players couldn't survive such an attack. There's no escaping this attack, no matter how hard you try to hide. And that's Hellcat's greatest asset. At this time, Ray's eyes lit up in anticipation, and he said that it was wonderful, because he had been waiting for this moment. And then the system told him that the beginner's skill was activated. Ray pushed off the ground and rushed upward with such force that the ground broke beneath his feet. The system reported that the strength of the kicking attack had increased by 50%. A blue flame erupted. At this time, Ray remembered that the flame that destroys everything in its path is a powerful spell, but the moment of casting it, the boss is completely defenseless. And the monster is so focused on casting the spell that it can't even move. In short, even a level 1 player will be able to swat him with one precise blow to the head. Ray flew above the goat and pushed off the ceiling with his feet, pointing the tip of his sword downward. Ray plunged the sword into the monster's head. The monster didn't move anymore, and only a small flame escaped from its mouth. Ray told the goat that if he had already started to cast the spell, he couldn't interrupt it. And in that state, his flames would just eat away at his insides. And he can't survive his own flames. After that, Ray flew above the monster. Flames began to burst from every crevice of the goat, destroying it. After the flames died out and the body was burned, the guys approached the corpse, and the system reported that the unique boss Hellbender had been defeated. The girl almost cried with happiness. She couldn't believe they had survived. The boy also breathed a sigh of relief. However, the team members were only confused by the fact that Ray had defeated the boss without being injured in the process. And suddenly the system alerted. Ray was the first in the entire world to manage to kill a unique boss. And for that, he is awarded a unique title, Conqueror Novice. Ray was surprised, as there were no such titles in the game, but the games were different in some ways. And the system also reported that the unique title increases his attack power by 50% when attacking bosses. Ray said that sounded really good. The system replied that he was the first in the entire world to be granted a unique title, and as a bonus for such an achievement, he could choose his own subclass. The guy was surprised at such generosity, so early in the game, and already such a tough choice. A window appeared in front of the guy, asking the system if Ray wanted to choose a subclass right now. Ray said that was a stupid question, and the answer was obvious. After that, he pressed the button yes. The system immediately warned the guy that once a subclass was selected, it would be impossible to change it. Ray was then in another space. He touched a panel, and everything around him glowed. He leaned his palm against the wall and mentally said that he needed a soulsmith subclass. And after those words, energy waves began to pass through his hand to his entire body, creating an energy field around the guy. The system was immediately notified that the Soulsmith subclass was now available to him, and they congratulated him wholeheartedly. Ray smiled and said he was after the money and ended up making a real score. Now the guy decided to see what he got from the monster. A key and a dagger appeared in front of him. The girl saw it and said that's the key to the underground waters. These are special hunting grounds where you can not only get pumped, but also earn good money. The guy was supportive and said that according to Light, it was a very rare drop, which is what he was getting the group together for. Ray twirled the key on his finger and said that it wasn't that rare and the drop of this key was 100%. The guy became embittered and started yelling and asking how Ray even knew that. And the girl couldn't understand why he was talking so smugly. Ray just looked at them, took the dagger in his hand, and said, "Infernal dagger. It was indeed a rare item." The boy walked over to one of the rubble and lightly touched it with his dagger. The stone immediately shattered into 2 pieces. The girl couldn't believe her eyes that Ray had just cut the stone like butter with his dagger. However, Ray said that it was a very weak result, and decided to test the new class on it, hoping that he had enough materials to improve. A subclass, as the name implies, is an additional class to an existing class. And most of those subclasses are useless, except for a couple of subclasses. And Soulsmith is one of them. People with this subclass are able to extract a soul fragment from all things: people, animals, plants, and ore. Different fragments gave different enhancements. Ray knew that with this subclass you could get through the damn game. He activated the Soul Eye, and the system alerted that the item could be awakened using the Soulsmith subclass. And the items required for such an awakening are AF rank, Mage, Soul Fragment. Ray looked at the girl, and the system immediately reported that the girl was at level 5, and it was possible to extract a fragment of the mage's soul. The prerequisite for extraction was signing a contract. Ray realized that this girl had a magic class. However, his plans didn't include a contract. He wanted to ask them for 90% of every boss they defeated. After a bit of thought, however, Ray realized it sounded more appealing. He stabbed his sword into the floor tiles and walked over to the boys. Ray asked them if they wanted to become stronger, and he said he could give them this key to do it. The guy immediately started jumping for joy and yelling that they really wanted it. Then Ray pulled out the contract and said that in that case they would bring him all the items on the list, and the key was a down payment. The boys almost cried with joy. They wanted to get rich with the key. Ray said there was no need to thank him, as the richer they became, the richer Ray himself would be. The system reported that Ray had made a contract with the girl, and all the conditions for extracting the soul fragment of a F-ranked mage have been fulfilled. A vessel appeared in front of the boy. The material was obtained, and Ray decided to start forging. The soulsmith skill was activated. Then a huge vortex of energy appeared, and the dagger began to merge with the vessel. Ray held his hands up and began to speak the incantation for the infernal dagger to awaken. After that, a bright flash appeared, and the system reported that the held dagger's awakening was successful. Ray took the dagger in his hand, and a notification came that the weapon's attack power had been increased and a new skill, Chopping Soul Strike, was available. The guy immediately wanted to test his new skill and took a swing. The guys were very scared and did not know what to expect. Ray struck with his dagger, releasing a powerful shockwave that reached the end of the corridor and beyond the shrine. The loud sound scared away all the birds in the neighborhood, and the sunlight penetrated the sanctuary and brightened the surprised faces of the boys. Ray looked up at the sky through the huge hole he'd made, a few shards still raining down on him. The frightened and shocked boys, meanwhile, lay on the ground and did not understand if it was possible for a human being to have such power. Having thus tested the strength of the blow, Ray said that it was not bad. Now he had weapons and skills, and only one thing left to do. After these words, he turned to the girl, and she was very frightened. She closed her eyes and covered her head with her hands. She closed her eyes and covered her head with her hands. But Ray just walked past and walked over to the wreckage. The girl was very surprised by this. She turned around and saw Ray sitting down next to the corpse and folded her hands to pray. Her eyes sparkled with admiration, and she wondered if he really wanted to honor the dead players. But that's not what happened. After the prayer, Ray picked the pockets of the corpses, and when he found the wallet, he started counting the money. The guy said it's his money now, and he thinks he'll definitely have enough for a cab. The guys were watching from the sidelines, and the girl said that Ray was more horrible than the most infernal goat, like a monster in human form. Some time passed. Ray headed off to his next destination. He came to the entrance of an abandoned temple. Once inside, Ray looked around and walked forward along the path until he came across a well. Inside the well, he noticed a ladder and decided to go down. Ray knew there was a well in the old temple that had been abandoned by everyone, and that at the bottom of the well, there is a secret dungeon where you can easily gain experience. The monsters there are pretty strong, and you'll need a group of at least 3 people to get through this dungeon. But now that Ray had awakened the infernal dagger, he was sure that all the experience and money would be his. After a few minutes, the boy went down to the very bottom of the well, and as soon as he put his foot on the ground, a huge gold coin flew at him. Ray noticed it in time and immediately swung his dagger, cutting the coin into 2 pieces. After which, he took a fighting stance, and both halves of the coin fell behind his back. Seeing those who tossed the coin, Ray was a little wary. It was a team of 3. The ringleader of the group, named Cookie, approached Ray and said with an evil smirk that he had entered their territory. Ray was surprised and held out his dagger, asking why on earth this was their territory. Cookie looked at him arrogantly and asked if Ray knew the golden rule: first up, first down. Ray told the ringleader that if they had a group of 3, he could show some great grounds for experience, for a fee of course. In response, a guy named Ion said they were fine here, and a big closet-looking guy named Adrian suggested that Ray pay them, and they'd let him pass on. Ray took a deep breath and realized that he was facing the new entrepreneurs of this new world. He rolled his eyes and wondered how much they wanted for a pass. Cookie smiled and said they were asking for $50,000 an hour, and there were tons of monsters ahead, and if Ray defeated them, he could recoup the money he spent. Ray agreed to the deal and handed him a stack of money, telling him he'd make up for what he'd spent quickly. Cookie wished him luck and told him he had the place to himself for exactly 1 hour. They let him through without any problems, and Ray found himself in a cave with crystals. It was the wolf's den. Hearing a loud howl, Ray immediately stopped and looked around. Animal footsteps could clearly be heard. The pack of wolves surrounded the guy on all sides, and they started howling loudly. Ray didn't move. Suddenly, he noticed a wolf with glittering eyes in front of him. Ray immediately realized that it was a diamond wolf, a mid-level monster with a low health score. He took a deep breath and wondered why the whole pack had come at him. He could have used a soul-cutting blow, but he decided to save his strength. Suddenly, the wolves howled loudly, signaling the beginning of the attack. They began to jump down from the rocks and attack the boy at the same time. But as soon as the wolves began to approach, Ray would chop off their heads, limbs, and anything else he could get his hands on. After dealing with all the wolves, Ray crouched down on a rock to rest and catch his breath. He then pulled some tea out of his pocket with a smile and decided that now he could have some refreshment, as his throat was dry after such a battle. Ray stuck a straw into the tea bag and began to drink. At that moment, Adrian appeared behind him. He swung around and was about to strike. Ray noticed it just in time. He tossed the tea aside and grabbed the dagger, blocking the blow. Then he took the dagger more comfortably and struck so that his opponent leaned back, tried to dodge. Ray's punch was so strong that it reached the ceiling and made a loud sound. There was a distance between them. Rocks sprinkled from the ceiling. A wound on Adrian's forehead was bleeding, and he said with a wide grin that Ray had almost stabbed him. Ray was silent, thinking that Adrian had managed to dodge his blow, which meant he was no stranger to fighting against humans. So he asked Adrian if it was too low to attack from the back when he was distracted by the monsters. Adrian smiled wickedly, his eyes sparkling with rage, and he replied that that was the best part. Ray got angry and asked if Adrian was holed up in these grounds waiting for strong players with decent loot, who could be eliminated while they try to deal with the monsters. Adrian just smiled silently. Suddenly Cookie showed up with Ion and told Ray that he was very guessing. Ray looked at them scornfully and said that this was a real wolf den, a gathering of hyenas. He wondered why he was the only one who'd thought to go there. Ray looked into Cookie's eyes and said threateningly that he should have recruited a stronger group because they couldn't stand up to him. That made Cookie angry. Ray eyed each of them carefully and thought that when he met them, he didn't immediately notice that this Adrian Cabinet was the owner of a heavy arm. And this little Ion, with a sword in his hands that's bigger than him, puts magic on the weapon, increasing its sharpness. One blow, and you're in the grave. Ray also noticed that the ring on the hand of the ringleader of this gang was clearly some kind of problem. Meanwhile, Cookie adjusted his jacket and asked Ray to forgive them and allow them to make up for his comrade's gaffe. After saying that, Cookie waved his hand and a huge amount of gold coins sprinkled onto Ray. All of these moments landed with a clatter at the guy's feet. He tried to stay calm and control his facial expression. But at this moment, Ray was really angry that this jerk was throwing money around. It was sacrilege to throw 10,000 away. Cookie smirked and said that he seemed to have paid too much and asked that Ray pick up the excess and give it to him. Ray, of course, realized it was a trap. He asked Cookie how he compensates the victims, makes them kneel down, and pick up money from the ground. Ray had already realized that it was an explosive coin ring. These coins can explode at the will of the ring's owner. Cookie decided to play on his greed and ignorance. And then Ray told Cookie that if he gave him his money, he would so-and-so let them go in one piece from there. Cookie got angry and came down from the cliff, saying that Ray is not friendly with his head, and don't forget that the three of them will be fighting against him. Suddenly, Ray's eyes flashed blue, and he started shouting that he didn't care how many of them there were, even 100. Their fighting skills weren't worth a dime anyway. These words hurt Cookie badly. He reached out with a ring and formed a fiery explosion. The ringleader then started yelling that he had originally thought of just blowing Ray up, but now ordered his guys to chop the freak to pieces. Adrian immediately pounced on Ray. Using his punch, however, Ray managed to dodge. And at that moment, Ion appeared behind him. They surrounded the boy from all sides, Ray blocking their blows. He then gathered all his energy and used an attack, throwing those ghouls away in different directions. Ray got angry and said that he had paid them $50,000 to leave him alone for an hour, and they ended up breaking the deal themselves. And now they are obliged not only to return his money, but also to pay the interest on top. Cookie smiled wickedly and replied that he would pay the interest with his explosive coins. After saying that, he snapped his fingers and used the coin explosion technique. Thousands of coins chased after Ray. At this time, while the coins were chasing the guy, Ion decided to jump off the cliff and attack. However, Ray noticed and blocked his strike just in time. With a swipe of his dagger, Ray chopped Ion's sword into pieces. Cookie was watching the battle. He couldn't understand how Ray managed to break Ion's sword. He noticed that Ray was holding a dagger, an epic weapon. Ray fought Adrian and Ion lightly, but the ringleader thought they were higher level than Ray and definitely wouldn't lose to him. Explosive coins surrounded the guy on all sides. Ray was pissed that the jerk was throwing money around like that and couldn't figure out if he had endless of it. Meanwhile, Adrian attacked from the back, using a missile strike attack. He struck with such force that the shards flew in different directions. Ray's dagger floated in the air. Adrian emerged from the pall of dust and cheered loudly, saying that it had been a great blow and that Ray would surely die from such a blow. Ion, meanwhile, was pretty pissed off that Adrian hadn't thought of the others. He could have been hurt too, after all. More important to Ion, however, was the fact that repairing his sword would now cost money. Happy Cookie at this time walked over to the dagger, picked it up from the ground, and said that no matter how rare the weapon was, it was worthless in the hands of a weakling. And suddenly Ray used the soul-capturing skill. Chains enveloped Adrian and Ion's bodies, preventing them from even moving. Cookie watched them with fear in his eyes. He watched the chains squeeze their bodies tighter and tighter. Adrian and Ion were screaming heavily. A worried and agitated Cookie called out to them, hoping they could get out. Inexplicably, Ray's voice appeared from nowhere. He began to say that with the help of the soulsmith skill, he had literally squeezed their souls into a vice. And suddenly Ray appeared from the remaining puffs of dust. He said that torture was far worse than death itself. Cookie was overcome with rage. He couldn't contain himself any longer and ran at Ray with a dagger in his hands. But as soon as Cookie got close, Ray grabbed him with his hand and pushed him back. Then he looked him straight in the eye and told him that Cookie was too slow. Cookie frowned and asked if it was true. and after saying that with a crazy smile, he grabbed his jacket with his hands and started shaking it violently, coins sprinkled at a great speed. Employing such a stratagem, Cookie told Ray to now try to run away from him. However, Ray instantly used the soul-capturing skill, and the chains clamped onto Cookie's body. The chains then wrapped around his neck and began to tighten even tighter. Cookie started screaming and asking why the coin explosion hadn't happened. Ray replied that soul captivity could immobilize an enemy and deactivate skills if the enemy's level was far below his skill. It was like taking away a candy bar right in front of his face. These words hurt Cookie. He started shouting that it was impossible as his level 7, and he was one of the fastest developing players. As his body was squeezed by the chains, and he squirmed in pain, Ray said that such progress was indeed good for a beginner. Ray's eyes flashed blue again. He used his soul to see what he could get out of these idiots. When Ray looked at Adrian, the system alerted that Adrian was a F-rank fighter soul fragment. Condition: feed the host. Ray cast a glance at Ion. The system alerted that Ion was a F-rank warrior soul fragment. Condition: reunite with his younger sister. And then Ray looked at Cookie. F-rank mage soul fragment. Condition: to cause fear to pierce through the host's entire body. Ray took a deep breath and realized that Cookie was the only one he could get something with. Cookie was screaming in pain at this time. He begged to let them go, but not to kill them. Ray ran his finger over his dagger and replied that Cookie was talking nonsense, and what good would it do him to have him alive? Cookie was confused and asked what he was talking about. Ray started listing eyes, blood, organs. He said he could just cut them up and sell them for parts. Then he looked at Cookie with a smile and said that this way he would get his 50,000 back and the interest would be covered in no time. Suddenly, Ion started yelling at his boss that Ray was bluffing and shouldn't believe him since he wouldn't do such a thing to them. Ray thought at this point that of course he was bluffing. He needed the money, and he wasn't sure he could get to the organ sellers. However, he wasn't going to backpedal, so he told this gang that they weren't going to give him the money, so he would take it himself. Fear overcame Cookie. He asked for Ray to calm down, and he'd do anything to keep them from being killed. Cold sweat rolled down Cookie's forehead, drops of sweat mixed with drops of tears. The system alerted that Cookie was experiencing a fear that penetrated him to the bone. All the conditions for extracting a fragment of a F-rank mage's soul were met. A green vessel with a cap appeared, and the system notified that the mage soul fragment had been retrieved. In that same second, the chains released the entire gang, and they tumbled to the ground with a tremendous clatter. While they were trying to recover from the pain, Ray came over and provided them with papers to sign. After reading the papers, they were all incredibly angry. Cookie shouted that it was a real extortion, since 90% of the loot went to Ray. Ray looked at them with sparkling eyes and asked if they had anything against it. Out of fear, they all answered that they had nothing against it. Ray collected the documents with signatures and told them that they were now his obedient employees. And he warned them that if they dared evade the terms of the contract, he would personally come and take a share. And lastly, he said he knew someone was ratting them out, so he asked that they give him contacts. After saying that, Cookie got really angry and started asking why Ray needed this. Ray replied that newbies like them couldn't possibly have weapons like that, which meant they were working for someone who had fitted them with such equipment. Suddenly, Cookie fell to his knees, grabbing Ray's hands and begging him not to go to the boss because if he found out they lost, he'd flatten them to the ground. Then Ray pinned him to the ground with his boot and said, which means they're more afraid of the boss than they are of an operation to remove their organs without anesthesia. Ion couldn't stand it any longer. He gathered all his strength into a fist and ran, shouting that he wanted to live. Adrian shouted after him, trying to stop him. Ray looked at him and extended a finger forward, telling him that choosing to run away was a bad option. And at that very second, Ion's body was enveloped in chains. Ray lifted John above his comrades, and they began shouting that they would do anything. Then Ray said that he would seize the money and weapons as well. At this time, he was thinking about the fact that even quietly farming a level now can't be done without a stab in the back. But he doesn't even mind. After all, There was no one who could match his strength yet. The system notified that Rayendo was at level 36, Rookie Class, Soulsmith Subclass. Title Conqueror Novice. Unique feature increases attack power by 50% when attacking a boss. Soon night fell, and something very interesting was going on in one of the circus tents. There were gymnastics rings that were blazing with fire, and in the very center of the stage a guy named Roku was beating up a man. Roku delivered so many slaps and punches that blood spurted from the man's wounds, and he fell to the floor. The people who were sitting in the cage next to him asked, "One more?" They felt sorry for the man. They thought he was unlucky. Meanwhile, Roku shook the dirt off his palms and said that they couldn't even be trusted with the simplest of jobs. An evil smile appeared on his face, and he asked the man he had beaten if he was ashamed in front of his boss. Suddenly, one of the prisoners in the cage couldn't stand it and started yelling for Roku to stop, as this man could die. Roku turned around and replied with a wide smile that he didn't care, as they didn't want anyone who wasn't useful to the boss. At this point, their boss named Andre came out from backstage and asked what they were talking about. Hearing his voice, Roku turned around and greeted his boss nervously. Andre brushed his hair back with a smile on his face and asked how the discipline class was going. Suddenly, he crouched down next to the injured man and told Rock that he'd gotten too carried away, asking what would happen to the guy if he did break a bone or two. The wounded guy hugged the boss, and Andre said that their guild valued everyone. And even if they let him down once, they didn't deserve to be treated like that. Realizing he had been told off, Roku's hands began to shake and he apologized to his boss. Wounded looked at his boss with a smile and tears in his eyes and thanked him, saying he promises next time. But Andre didn't let him finish. He pulled a whip from his belt and swung it, hitting the guy right in the face. Blood gushed from the fresh wounds. Andre continued to beat him on the back, saying that such cattle should be treated like cattle. And if the bones break, he'll be useless, but a good whipping won't hurt any animal. After these words, the boss continued to beat him. Suddenly, he was interrupted. 3 guys came into the tent and called out to the boss, saying they were back. Andre turned around and glared menacingly at them, replying that somehow they were fast. Cookie nervously said that they had come to report that a group of 3 people had failed to complete the task. Andre's gaze fell on Cookie's hand. He didn't notice the ring on it and stared at them intently. And after a short pause, Andre asked where the ring he had lent him had gone. Cookie didn't say anything back. Andre started yelling that this ring was far more valuable than his pathetic life. Cookie's face covered in drops of sweat. He bowed to his boss and began to apologize, saying his ring had been taken from him. Then Andre asked what kind of monster it was. Cookie replied that it was a man like a monster. After saying this, the angry Andre hit him in the face with a whip. From such a blow, Cookie was thrown back a few meters. Andre was coming at him and shouting, asking what was even going on in his guild, and why only incompetent jackasses work for him. At that moment, Ion answered that question in his head, thinking that because all the normal guys had gotten away from him. Andre continued to beat up Cookie, saying that a jerk like him was only good for one job. After saying that, he called Roku over. Roku excitedly walked over to his boss, and Andre gave him an angry look, ordering him to let Johnny out. A few seconds later, the loud sounds of footsteps were heard. Johnny was loose and coming closer and closer. A huge white tiger appeared in front of Cookie. It opened its maw and roared with such force that the wind shook Cookie. He got very scared and started asking his boss that he wasn't serious about the whole thing. Cookie shouted that it wasn't his fault and that he had always faithfully obeyed all orders. However, Mad Andre smiled broadly and told Johnny it was time to eat. Johnny opened his mouth wide and was about to eat Cookie. The boy tried to get away, but the tiger grabbed his leg. At that moment, Ray jumped off the suspended metal bar and descended towards them. Ray pushed the tiger away from Cookie, and he managed to escape from the tiger's bloodthirsty paws. Ray struck again, and Johnny fell to the floor and whimpered. A worried Andre called out to the tiger, but it didn't respond. Ray looked at Andre and said that this hamster Cookie hadn't paid him the interest yet, and therefore didn't deserve to die yet. Andre at this time ran up to his kitty, who was crying in pain, and started asking where his little guy was hurting. Kuki pounced on Ray and started yelling that he was too late, as the tiger had almost turned him into fodder. Ray smiled and replied that it was not easy to get here unnoticed. While the team was chatting with Ray, an exasperated Andre turned around, pulled out his whip, and struck from the back right at Ray. However, Ray instantly reacted, took out his dagger, and cut the boss's whip into several pieces. An exasperated and surprised Andre asked who the hell Ray was and what he was forgetting in his domain. Ray's dagger glinted in his hand, and he replied that he was now their new master. Roku was furious at what he heard. He asked the trio that had they completely forgotten their place and how much the boss had done for them. Kuki started yelling back that Rocky doesn't understand anything. Ion backed up and said that he had no idea how awful Ray was, and he couldn't be denied. Ray smiled and turned to the imprisoned men in the cage. He told them that if they agreed to work for him, he would free them from this circus with this clown. The prisoners could not believe these words. One of them asked Ray if he would really save them from this hell. Ray smiled broadly and replied that he was giving them his word. He added that they would only have to give 50% of the loot, and he in turn will give them tips on how to get through this game. And that's far more beneficial than staying with a sadistic clown. The trio heard this and began to resent Ray for ripping them off for the whole 90%. Then Ray threateningly reminded them that they had tried to kill him. Meanwhile, Andre had already lost his temper, his anger overpowering him. He began to say that Ray had hurt his little Johnny, and now he was going to take his workers. His eyes glistened with rage, and he began to shout that he would send them all straight to the underworld. Andre then pulled out a gold card and said that unfortunately for them, he had this. It was a guild certificate. It confirmed the card holder as the head of the guild and also provided him with all the necessary procedures to fulfill his administrative duties. Ray saw this map and asked what kind of certificate it was. Andre said that the Japanese government must have gotten a lot of insight into what was going on in Moscow. Raz has decided to endow the guild masters with a document proving their status and power that will help pass this game. Andre smiled evilly as he held the certificate forward and said that he was the law, and he could kill them if it would help him fulfill his administrative duties. Ray marveled at how much innovation there was in their country. He said that if he had that piece of paper, he could create a real money-making empire. Andre looked at him with disdain and said that Ray was an idiot, as he had to be a rank B or higher player to get certified. At that time, Roku brought his boss a weapon, and then Andre said that it didn't matter anymore, since Ray would die here anyway. After saying that, he grabbed a machine gun and started shooting wherever he could, shouting to everyone, "Bye-bye, bugs." However, Ray didn't even move. The bullets flew past at an incredible speed without hitting him. Ray took out a fragment of the wizard's soul, after which he activated the skill, Soul Barrier. After that, Ray reached forward and a protective field appeared in front of him that bullets couldn't penetrate through. Andre, meanwhile, didn't stop. He kept shooting and screaming that no barrier would stop him. After all, Moscow even launched a nuke during the ice challenge, but it didn't work in the end. Then Ray, standing on the other side of the barrier, asked Andre if he knew why players don't go with firearms on monsters. Andre didn't listen and kept firing. Then Ray wrestled his weapon away from him and began to press the barrier like a wall. The boss found himself pressed against the wall by the barrier, about to be flattened like a bug by a soul. Ray stepped up close to Andre, and Andre found himself pinned down even harder, so hard that the wall behind him was already starting to break. Ray took a step back, and Andre was able to exhale. Ray looked at him disdainfully and said that skills were the weapon of this century, and no firearms trinkets can compare to skills and abilities. It's worth realizing. The prisoners in the cage watched it all and couldn't believe that Ray had defeated the boss. Ray walked up to them and asked if they were thinking of contracting him, since he'd even let this clown in for their fun. The prisoners began tugging on the bars and begging for Ray to let them out and give them a chance to get even with the creep, and then they would be okay with it. Andre heard all this and told Ray that contracting a bunch of people without a guildmaster's license is crazy, and the police won't stand aside. Roku asked his boss to save his strength and calm down. Then Ray asked Andre what he seemed to be ranting about, that you could do whatever you wanted with cattle. Andre remained silent and lowered his head, and Ray let the men out of the cage, and they approached their abuser. Andre and Roku looked up and saw a bunch of angry people who were ready to tear them apart. A real massacre had begun. Ray thought at this time that he had gotten the labor force for nothing, and he could rely on them for a while. So now he could get on with the pressing matters at hand. Ray opened the task window and found that there was a month left, so it was time. Sometime later, one sunny day, Ray arrived at the certified examination site at the headquarters of the Players Association. He was walking down a crowded street, holding a bottle of his favorite drink, tea, in his hand. Suddenly, Ray heard the guys behind him discussing something about players and ranks. He listened. The guys were saying that players with B rank abilities, or even higher, could be recruited by the guild and would be heavily sponsored. An annual salary of $10 million. One of the guys told them not to get too caught up in dreaming too much, as only 1% of all players have a B rank. And rank A players in general are only 9 people in Japan. Then one of them laughed and said that he would become the 10th. His friends told him that there was no harm in dreaming, and they laughed too. Overhearing their conversation, Ray thought it had been like 2 weeks since the merging of their world and the world of the game. And initially, many players decided to accept the challenge from the Japanese government to get 100 million. However, the result of such a prank was deplorable. All players are now required to register with the association. Without membership, no one will be allowed into challenges or dungeons. It will be impossible to get rewards either. Replaying those thoughts in his head a few times, Ray decided that those guys had great ambition, and he would have to have zeal like them. As Ray walked around, he noticed someone from the roof watching him. The stalker noticed Ray looking at him, and that's when he threw a road sign at the guy, which hit the sidewalk. The stalker missed a little. Ray wasn't afraid of him, but the people around him were very scared. One passerby exclaimed, "What the hell is going on? Did a road sign fall out of the sky?" Takuo's loud voice could be heard on the roof, calling for Ray, saying that he had finally appeared. Ray looked up and saw Takuo. He told the boy that he couldn't get away from him this time, and jumped off the roof. Ray was surprised and curiously asked Takuo if he too had come here to take the exam. Takuo smiled back, and then Ray asked him if he realized that even with a beginner's punching skill, Ray would be able to blow his head off. Takuo raised his head proudly and replied that Ray didn't think he was the same weakling he was. Now Takuo bragged that he had a new class, the Spearman. Ray laughed out loud and asked him, "Isn't the Spearman class for idiots?" Takuo was very angry, and he could barely contain himself. Takuo was very angry and could barely contain himself. He asked Ray what his class was then. Ray looked him straight in the eye and replied with a smile that his class was beginner. Takuo started laughing and asked if such a class even existed or if Ray was noodling around with him. Ray replied that he wasn't lying, and his main profession was novice. Takuo then grabbed a road sign and said he would believe him, but only to first demonstrate what the class of the Spearman could do. After those words, Takuo struck with his spear. Ray easily dodged his blow and began to approach him. Takuo couldn't understand what was going on. Ray came up close to him and said that he didn't want to get into trouble before the exam, but Takuo had provoked him himself. Ray then waved his hand and sent Takuo flying. The people passing by couldn't understand what was happening. A few meters later, Takuo landed loudly and fell with his whole body onto the sidewalk, breaking the tiles beneath him. Passers-by crowded around him to render aid, and some looked at Ray in shock. However, Ray answered them that it was self-defense and nothing more. After that, Ray went to the association. The girl at the front desk informed him that the fee for providing the exam would cost $8,000. Ray was surprised at the amount and thought it was a real rip-off, but he still had to pay. Then he sat down and waited with his head down. The association worker approached him and apologized with a smile for the wait. Ray looked up and saw the girl in front of him. She sweetly corrected her glasses and told Ray that they were starting the ranking exam. After a while, they came to a huge purple crystal that was floating in the air. Ray looked at the crystal and wondered if that was the whole point of the test. He asked the girl that he just needed to put his hand on the stone. Ray hesitantly began to reach for the huge crystal, and energy from his fingertips was channeled into that crystal. Suddenly, the crystal began to emit a very strong energy, which surprised the girl very much. She couldn't understand what was happening. Because of the energy Ray released, the crystal changed its color to bright blue. The girl was confused. She didn't understand what it all meant and how she should proceed. After a while, the girl banged her palm on the table very loudly and yelled Ray's name. On very strong emotions, the girl informed him that based on the results of the exam, they would classify his abilities into the A rank category. She also said that Ray may have already heard about it, but players can also change their classes. A master of the sword, a great magician, an archbishop. If Ray only wishes, they, as an association, will fully assist him in doing so. After listening to the girl, Ray replied that he was declining since there wasn't one he wanted among their list of classes. The girl was greatly surprised and asked what kind of class he wanted. Ray advised her not to fill her head with unnecessary information. Then the girl said that if Ray wanted a certain class, it wouldn't be possible to change classes without a special subject, and the association would be able to provide such an item. However, Ray replied that if he needed it, he could get it himself. The girl didn't know what to say to him anymore. Then Ray asked if there were any more questions for him. The girl lowered her head down and asked if he wasn't making things even more difficult for himself. Ray didn't understand what she meant. Then she explained that his power was currently superior to all A rank holders. And if he refused to sign the contract and change class, then according to the new law, Ray would get rank E. And E rank players get a lot of restrictions. For example, they can't form guilds or change class. And by refusing to do so, Ray will make things worse for himself. Ray sighed and said that it wasn't the first time the government had come up with stupid rules. At this moment, he thought that if he needed this guild master certificate so badly, he could force one of the B-ranked workers to get it. Ray knew that there was only one class that would be able to fulfill the last test in the game. And until he showed up, Ray wasn't going to change classes for the sake of a check mark. And so Ray asked the girl that even if he had rank E, and if he passed the last test, he would still get 100 million from the government. The girl replied that she did, and Ray asked her to stop this talk and register it as rank E. She could do no more and agreed, informing him that they would issue him an E-ranked player card. After a while, Ray was walking down the street where a large number of players had gathered. The people around him were shouting the slogan that if one had a C rank, one should safely join their guild. They invited everyone to join their Artemis guild, starting at rank 0 and above. As he passed by, Ray thought about the fact that callers don't waste time. They'll do anything to attract talent. Suddenly, two pretty girls appeared in front of him, complimenting Ray and telling him that he was strong, suggesting that he join their guild. Then Ray glanced at them glumly and said that he had an E rank. The girls were immediately embarrassed and apologized for disturbing him. Ray realized that if he mentioned the E rank, everyone would immediately look away like a leper. But he didn't intend to work for anyone, so he didn't care. Suddenly, Ray noticed a person in the crowd whose aura was very different from the others. The man noticed Ray in the crowd as well and smiled back at him, approaching him. A man approached Ray, said hello, and asked if he was a man named Rayendo. Then he held out a card and said it was his business card. Ray took the card to look at it. The name of the guild, Wings of Creation, was written on it. The name was Shinji Saito. Ray noticed that the people around him started pointing their fingers at this man and saying that he was the strongest player named Herd from the Wings of Creation Guild. Then Ray addressed him by the name Herd. The man scratched the back of his head and said it was an old nickname that had been around since the game itself. Ray immediately thought that if he was a local celebrity, he was worth blowing off. So he asked Herd what he owed him. Suddenly, Takuo began to make his way out of the crowd. He shouted that these were the Wings of Creation and they were probably looking for him. Takuo approached Herd from the back and started saying that if they wanted to get the incomparable player, he was willing to join their guild just for a decent fee. Ray at this time thought that once again, this knucklehead was following him. And suddenly he realized that this dumbass had gotten a B rank and the feeling that he was just threatening the examiner. Meanwhile, Herd raised his hands in surprise and apologetically asked Takuo who he was. Takuo was angry that they hadn't heard from him. He took her by the tie and said he was going to show what he could do. However, no sooner had Takuo raised his arm than Herd had already twisted him and was pressing him harder and harder, about to break his arm. Takuo began to scream in pain, and Herd said that he didn't want to waste his time on petty things while the end of existence was near. He ordered Takuo to get out of his sight immediately. An offended Takuo went away and said lastly that even if they came crawling to him with pleas for help, he would not help. Afterward, Ray and Herd moved to a quieter area of the cafe. Herd apologized for Ray having to witness such an unpleasant scene. Ray replied that there was no need to apologize, as it's always nice when assholes are put in their place. After saying that, Ray asked what Herd needed since rank he wouldn't be of any use anyway. Herd asked him to take it easy, and said that Ray had only gotten that rank because he refused to change class. Then Ray said that the association was more talkative than he thought. Herd said that their guild is directly connected to the association, and before the end of existence, each of them must rally for a common goal, even if that information ends up costing a tidy sum. And after saying that, Herd made an offer. If Ray agreed to join the Wings of Creation, they would pay him as much as they paid the association about providing his personal information. Herd discreetly handed the check to the boy. Ray took the paper and was simply shocked at the amount he saw. 10 million. Ray realized that if it were him now, the past him who had worked on the construction site, he would have agreed without hesitation. However, this time, he refused Herd and said that he wasn't really interested in joining the guild. Herd laughed and said that of course it was rude to offer such a talent at such a low price. And then Herd asked, what about giving Ray information? He explained that their guild cooperates with many countries, and they are believed to have the most extensive database. They agreed to make all the arrangements for Ray and help him find anything he wants. Ray thought about such a tempting offer and asked Herd if any of their sources were those who had managed to get through the game. Herd laughed, spreading his hands, and said it was nonsense, as there was no one in the whole world who had passed the game. Ray got a little angry and replied that since there was no one, then he would definitely refrain from any kind of suggestions. Herd was greatly surprised and said that he would pay for the coffee, and if Ray changed his mind, he could contact them anytime. Leaving, Herd couldn't understand why he had given up so quickly. He concluded that he just didn't want to push the guy around without ruining the guild's image. However, he immediately admitted to himself that it was something else. He was afraid of Ray. His instincts were screaming at him to run and not make the beast angry. Suddenly, Ray spooked Herd. He handed him a piece of paper and told him that if they needed help, they could call. And depending on the fee, Ray would agree to a mission from their guild. Herd frantically took the paper and thanked the guy, thinking in his head, who the hell is he? A short while later, Herd arrived at the headquarters of the Wings of Creation Guild. He entered the guildmaster's spacious office and announced that he had arrived with a report. The girl turned to him with a smile and told him that he had done a great job, asking if he had met the strongest rookie. Herd was visibly nervous, drops of sweat running down his forehead. He replied that he had met this man, and he was a monster. Nervously clenching his palms behind his back, he told me that this was the first time he had met a player who literally instills fear. Suddenly, the guild leader began to emit a frightening aura and asked who was scarier, that newcomer or her. Her became even more nervous. The chapter embarrassed him, and he stiffened with fear. The head ordered him to relax, and took out the document proving Ray's a rank, and said that it was obvious enough here. Herd exhaled a sigh of relief and apologized to the chapter. The chapter asked him not to apologize, since he had told what he had seen with his own eyes. And besides, she's the most inexperienced of the 10 excellent ones. No wonder there are people much stronger than her. She is the head of the Wings of Creation Guild, and her name is Yamagata Tsukino. The 10 great ones are the strongest players in the game. 10 players who can compete for the $100 million prize. In a world where the game has merged with reality, they're the ones who have gained power. And even their presence affects the balance of power between countries. Tsukino asked, since Herd had returned alone. Did that mean Ray had turned down their offer? Herd got pretty emotional and started telling me that he wasn't interested in their information database or the $10 million check. Sakino replied thoughtfully that if Ray was actually the 10th, he might not make that kind of money. Then Herd said that if Ray is really the 10th, he doesn't understand why he clings to the rookie class so much. It's a useless class. After all, if Ray had agreed to a rank upgrade, he would have unlocked items that boosted his stats. Such items are simply not available to regular players. Sakino smiled and replied to Herd that she appreciated his assumptions. However, if what he said was true, Ray isn't just one of them. He could be the last unknown of the 10 great ones. Herd was surprised at such musings and asked if Sakino meant that Ray was number 1. Sakino explained that thanks to American intelligence, it was possible to find the 9 strongest players and rank them according to their strength. But they never found a number 1 man, thinking he didn't exist at all. Sakino also revealed that there were rumors that the U.S. was deliberately hiding the number 1 so that his power would only be in their hands. Herd fully supported the chapter and said he was of the same opinion. However, when he met Ray, he became convinced that this guy could very well be number 1. Sakino got up from her chair and confidently placed her hands on the table and said that since that was the case, they had a good chance of winning. The girl went to the window and ordered that Herd give the guild members a message. Any aggressive and malicious actions towards Ray would be severely punished. Getting close to the window, Sakino said it was best not to cross the dragon's path unnecessarily. Herd listened to all the instructions and promised to carry them out and to warn everyone. After a few weeks, Ray was able to rent an office in an apartment complex. It became the headquarters for him and his employees. Ray was admiring the view from the window, and suddenly one of the workers called out to him. The guy asked how best to hang the TV, a little to the left or right. Ray replied that they could hang it however they wanted. At this time, Cookie brought a suitcase filled with money and said it was the proceeds for today. Ray took the wad of money, his eyes shining with happiness. He asked how the group pumping was going. Cookie replied that everything was going according to his recommendations. He said that right now, groups are still pumping in the underground waters, making 1 million in a day. And even the newbies are making 10,000 a day or more. Cookie started jumping with happiness and saying that he had never dreamed of such money, and it was all thanks to Ray. Ray frowned as he adjusted the money-counting machine and said he'd told them, hadn't he? If they get rich, Ray gets even richer. And Ray also said that Cookie and the others might as well earn a bonus for doing so well. At this time, Cookie thought that even though he was giving Ray 90% of his earnings, the bonus was still high. If he worked in a normal guild, he wouldn't even earn that much in a year. Ray was admiring the money, but Cookie did remind him that there were 10 days left until the end of the land challenge, and the prize money had gone from 100 million to 400 million. Ray replied that that was true, but he didn't want to be in any particular hurry. Suddenly, their dialogue was interrupted by the breaking news on the television. The reporter was telling us that the land trials were in full swing, and if nothing is done, Japan will be destroyed in 10 days. The anchors reported that the situation had not improved in 47 days. Suddenly, a letter was brought to the anchorwoman right on air. The girl read the letter and said that the Japanese government sent this. Appeal to all players. At the moment, the reward for passing the land test is 1 billion. The presenters began to discuss that it seems the government is completely desperate, hoping that there will be someone who can prevail before the end begins. Ray pondered and said that if we keep dragging this out, foreign guilds will flock to this reward. So it's time to save Japan. Ray picked up his clothes and announced that he was leaving. Cookie was surprised and asked if Ray was going alone. Ray smiled and replied that he couldn't possibly endanger his money hamsters. The employees immediately blurted out their feelings and almost cried. However, Ray created an evil aura and said, "You want what you want? He's the only one who will get the billion." Then it became clear to Cookie and everyone else what the real reason was, and it wasn't a concern for them at all, just a desire to make money. After a while, a crowd of people gathered at the huge gate, all of them eager to save the world and make money. Ray was also heading toward that gate. Herd was among that crowd, and he was just calling Ray. And turning around, Herd spotted him and greeted him, saying that Ray had come after all, and that was a very good thing. However, Ray passed and said that he had no intention of cooperating with them. Herd was confused and replied that it was a great pity, as he wanted to discuss the money issue with him. The words about money, of course, interested the guy. Herd offered him to carry the luggage, and they would pay $100 million for it. Ray wanted to see the luggage. Herd led him to a warehouse where there were a bunch of military large backpacks. He said he wanted Ray to deliver the load to his comrades. Ray was confused by such an offer, just for shipping $100 million, so he decided to see what was in those backpacks. Herd replied that there was food in there. When he opened one of the backpacks, Ray made sure there was food in there. However, he was interested in something unusual. Ray pulled out a baggie, and Herd explained that they were chocolates, their head's favorite food. Also, Herd explained that their camp is located on level 5, the deepest part of the Earth Test dungeon. But conquest is a long process, so their squad is running out of food. Ray said bluntly that it smacks of ulterior motives, since just for shipping they're willing to pay $100 million. They could have found someone else instead of waiting for him. Herd smiled and replied that he wished he could object and say that the guild was just being very generous, but Ray was right. And so Herd revealed that they had already sent 39 groups to the 5th level, but in the end the groups never made it to the end of the route. Ray asked, "What do you mean they didn't make it?" At this time he thought, is the test of the land different now than it was in the game? Herd, meanwhile, had been watching the fellow closely and had come to the conclusion that he definitely knew something. He told Ray that regarding the differences, their recon team had determined that this dungeon remained the same in structure as in the game. But none of the remaining players can reach the depths of the dungeon, and those who were able to do so are already there, waiting for supplies. Ray turned around and was about to leave, but Herd started yelling that he was the only one who could get to the guildmaster at the moment. The guy came up to the luggage and said that they were short of workers, but since he was getting paid, it was a sin to complain. Ray slung his backpack on his back and checked with Herd that if he delivered the load quickly, he could hope for a speed bonus. Herd smiled embarrassedly and promised to clarify the matter right away. Ray thought about how much he could get from this guild. Herd ended the phone call and said that he had been told that if Ray delivered the shipment within a day, he would be paid an additional $50 million. That was fine with the guy. Ray went on his way and told Herd in parting that he could do it in an hour, not a day. A little later, on the 3rd level of the Earth Test, 2 people were standing in front of a huge monster, and behind their backs lay the slain. Suddenly, a huge grasshopper struck, but the guy managed to stop this attack. He held back the monster's paw and held on with his last strength. The guy's body was shaking with tension. He shouted to the girl to leave immediately, but the girl could not leave him in trouble. The guy smiled and thanked her for all she had done, but told her to leave as she had to save herself. The girl started crying and screaming loudly at the guy, calling him by his name Michael. She couldn't stand the fact that he was sacrificing himself. At that time, Ray ran past them and chopped the monster into several pieces in one move. Michael scrambled off his feet and fell to the ground. He couldn't believe that he was saved. The girl began to thank Ray for saving their lives. However, before they could blink, Ray had rushed very far away. This surprised the guys as they didn't even get to talk to their savior. Ray continued to be carried at a great speed through this dungeon. He wondered if the monsters were over. After a while on the 5th level of the Earth Test, Ray was running through a long cave and suddenly stopped. He looked at his watch and said he'd done it even faster. It's the easiest money he's ever made. Suddenly, a man appeared and marveled that someone had managed to get to level 5. He immediately assumed it was Ray. Ray confirmed his identity and asked if the man was a member of the Wings of Creation Guild. The man confirmed it, and Ray handed him the backpack. Ray said he delivered the shipment on time, and so he is waiting for his delivery payment. The man replied that the case had been assigned to him, and he had already wired the money because Herd had assured him that Ray would handle the assignment quickly, so he hadn't waited. Ray pulled out his phone and checked his account. He had a transfer from the guild of $150 million. He thanked and said that he was always happy to cooperate. The man turned to his team and said that they had waited so long for this, and now the food had arrived. The boys immediately pounced on the backpack and started grabbing food. They called Ray their savior, as they thought they were going to starve to death. Ray watched from the sidelines and told the man that their situation was SOSO. The man replied with sadness in his eyes that it was. He said that they had lost many in the conquest. Suddenly, scouts came running up and shouted that monsters were coming and that they had to run away. The man said they wouldn't get them here and should calm down, but he noticed that the scouts were very tired and asked what had happened to them. Suddenly, there was a very loud sound that made them all cover their ears, and after that a huge ball of dust appeared. A huge number of dragonflies, with sharp noses, burning red eyes, flew towards them. Ray immediately realized that it was a swarm. However, strong streams of fire came from somewhere. The guy was surprised by it. Sakino was already standing behind him with sword in hand, and, with her fire attack, she was destroying the monsters that were flying towards her team. Ray looked at her closely and realized that she was using the secret technique of a special elementalist class flame of destruction. He didn't know that there were already those who had mastered this class. Sakino straightened out all the bugs, and stepping on the last one, she told Ray that she was glad to have such an encounter. The girl thanked him for daring to take on a mission from her guild, and after saying that, she introduced herself as the head of the Wings of Creation Guild, Yamaga Sakino. She suggested that Ray work hand in hand from now on. Ray began to emit a strong aura, but when Sakino began to approach him, he too felt a strong aura emanating from her. Sakino looked him straight in the eyes, and her aura was literally staggering in its power. However, as the girl stepped closer to Ray, she stumbled and almost fell. Sakino laughed and immediately apologized, explaining that she hadn't eaten anything in a long time, so her legs weren't holding her up at all. Ray said that he had heard that they were out of supplies, but that this was the first time he had heard that they were starving. At this time, behind his back, a real canned food fight was going on among the crew. After a while, Ray and Sakino decided to continue their conversation in the tent. The guy asked her if she was the strongest among her squad. Sakino replied that she was. Sakino was finally able to enjoy her favorite chocolates and revealed that although she was the last in strength, she was a member of the 10 excellent ones. At this time, Ray was enjoying his favorite tea, and he was surprised by such a marvelous name, 10 excellent. He asked what it was. Sakino got angry, jumped up from her chair, and slammed her palms on the table and started shouting that the name wasn't strange. And it's the name of the top 10 players who are in the top 10 with the time of the game. And that was the name the government had given them. Ray remained calm and asked how the government had managed to calculate their strength. Sakino said that the data on the strongest players was obtained by U.S. Special Services. However, they still haven't been able to find a player who is first in the rankings. The girl also said that a dozen great players are sponsored by the government and asked if they weren't interested in him. The words about sponsorship interested Ray, and he asked how much the government was paying them. Sakino replied that it usually depends on the country the player lives in. In Japan, it is around 1 million. And that's when things started to make sense to Ray. Now he understood where that first million had come from. In his head, he was very angry because people like this caused him to become a gambler, eventually almost losing his life. Ray realized that if he was still number one, it was worth keeping it quiet, since if anyone found out, there would be no avoiding trouble. That's why he told Sakino that 1 million is some kind of pittance, since even the reward for passing the test of the land is much higher. The girl replied that the amount may not be significant, but the biggest money is being made by those who know anything about playing this game. And that's because no one's ever been able to defeat the local boss. Ray then asked that even if she was one of the top 10 players, Sakino couldn't beat him. The girl replied that no matter how strong she was still an ordinary person. Sakino explained that if she had the level and equipment of her in-game avatar, maybe she could do well. But in the current situation, it was unlikely that she would be able to prevail. Ray stood up and said that he had accomplished the mission, and if they needed help, they could go to him. And depending on their fee, they could make a deal. The guy headed for the exit, pondering that now it was time to kick the ass of the boss living on this level. since 1 billion wouldn't earn itself. Suddenly, Tsukino jumped up and started asking for Ray to stop. She shouted loudly and asked that they defeat the local boss together. The crew heard this, and they didn't like it. They started shouting that they could do it without Ray, and they didn't want to mess with that weirdo. Tsukino turned to them and reminded them in a gruff tone that any aggressive actions towards Ray would be severely punished. The team members quieted down, and the girl said that she understood their displeasure. However, she didn't want to lose anyone else. All of the team members immediately had flashbacks of fighting the boss. Tsukino tried to overpower him with hellfire. However, the defenses had already been breached, and her team members were unable to fight. The girl ordered everyone to retreat, and those who could still move tried to help the wounded. Then one of the team members told her that if they retreated, she might get hurt. But Tsukino gave the retreat command to avoid more casualties. Suddenly, one of the warriors held back the boss attack and told Tsukino to leave while he held back the monster. The girl didn't want to leave and told him to go with everyone else. However, the warrior disobeyed, and the monster destroyed him before Tsukino's eyes. She watched this and couldn't even move from her seat. So now Tsukino treasures even the life of even one person on her team. She wants to keep everyone. The girl told her team that she believes that together with Ray, they can avoid big losses. She began shouting to her warriors that mopping up the land test and restoring the balance of power in Japan was all they could do to honor their fallen comrades. Suddenly, Tsukino was approached by Ray and told that it was a heartwarming speech and he was touched, but she could have done without being so crucified. He turned around and said with a smile, because he himself is able to overpower the boss alone. Ray walked out of the tent, and Tsukino thought, what an ego this guy has. But what if he's number one? She wondered if they were wrong about him, and how Ray was going to fight alone. She wondered if they were wrong about him, and how Ray was going to fight alone. So Tsukino ran to catch up with Ray and said that Ray had talked about her being able to go to him for help. She shouted after him that she was ready to hire him as part of a group to conquer the boss. Ray immediately stopped and thought he could finally smell money. He turned around and replied that he felt like she needed more than just defeating her boss, but something else as well. Tsukino said that she realized that they were asking for something exorbitant, so they were willing to pay compensation for the inconvenience. The words about compensation made Ray's eyes shine. He said that 10 million from each member of the group would be great. And on top of that, Ray set conditions. 1, they pay the advance. 2, they don't tell anyone what they saw in that fight. The team was furious at the demands. Ray said that they wanted everyone to survive and defeat the boss, so that was the price. Tsukino smiled and replied that she agreed. The team members started shouting, trying to stop her. The angry girl turned to the team and ordered everyone to listen to her. She told everyone to listen to Ray and help him win. Meanwhile, Ray wondered how much money this guild had, since it had so easily agreed to 10 million per person. A while later, they all set off together and stopped when they saw something terrible. A huge number of flying monsters were moving towards them. The guild members began to panic. Ray assumed an attack pose and told Tsukino that he could slaughter all those things for their money. However, the girl smiled and replied that she could handle them herself. Tsukino finished her chocolate bar and started laughing evilly. She used the all-consuming fire technique again. The monsters were literally being burned alive. Ray watched and thought it was pretty good. The team was proud of their leader. The girl finished, put down her sword, and told Ray that they could now continue their journey in peace. Ray looked at her and couldn't believe that this girl had been eating chocolates 10 minutes ago. He held out his phone and told her the advance had been deposited into his account. And now he's ready to pass Japan's first test with them and end this dungeon once and for all. A little while later, Ray stood quietly while the team members and Tsukino fought the monsters. During this battle, one of the team members asked the head if she was even sure about this guy. After all, considering how much she paid him, they expected more from his fighting skills. He's just using the usual attacks, that's all. Tsukino smiled and replied that wasn't exactly true. She told the man to look at the monsters Ray had killed. There were no visible injuries on them. However, they were definitely lying dead. Sakino argued that this was what proved his skillful skills. She noticed that Ray didn't even try to dodge, and his punches weren't exactly original. The only thing that was interesting to her was what Ray would show Ray in the room of the boss himself. After a while, the team arrived at the 5th level before the entrance to the boss room. Ray noticed how the team members shuddered at the mere sight of this entrance. They clearly had bad memories of this place. Sakino stepped forward and encouraged her warriors, saying that they must avenge their fallen comrades. She told them to use the most powerful blows they possessed as soon as the door opened. The gate opened. Sakino raised her sword up and ordered the team to advance. They rushed in with a shout. The huge spider was in the middle of the room, surrounded by its web. The team approached him closely, Ray keeping to the side. The monster opened its eyes, and the system informed them that the boss of the 5th level of the Earth test, the cinnabar spider, was in front of them. Sakino immediately used Hellfire to incinerate the monster. The rest of the team used Fire Fist and Phoenix Fury. Due to so many fire blows, an explosion occurred, engulfing the monster in flames. The team looked at this explosion and began to rejoice that they were able to defeat the monster. However, Ray said that wasn't true. The monster was still alive. And in that very second, the spider strikes so hard, forming a flash and throwing all the team members in different directions. The monster's web shone with a bright blue color, and having received so many attacks, there wasn't a single scratch on it. Sakino didn't understand how this was possible. She was sure that insect-like monsters were weak to fire damage. Ray replied that she was right, but the power of their blows was so small that they were incapable of damaging him. At that moment, the spider started shooting a huge amount of web directly at Sakino. The girl managed to dodge the attack. She landed on one knee and warned her team to beware the web, for if they got caught in its web, it would be very difficult to get out. Ray was standing behind the backs of the 2 guild members at this time and noticed the cobwebs flying in their direction. He immediately grabbed them and flew off with them, dodging the monster's attack. Ray then dragged them away from the spider and threw them on the ground. The guy smiled and apologized to Ray for having to cover them. Ray looked at him and replied that he shouldn't apologize because if they died, his reward would decrease. That's why he was saving their asses. And Ray also added that they can keep getting screwed over, and then for each such prank, they will have to pay another 1 million on top for each one. Ray realized that he could keep dragging out the fight, making another 1 million each on their stupidity, but their guild was tied directly to the government. And if he continued to act like this, he could get himself into trouble in the future. Ray stood at the top and decided to apply the Eye of the Soul. He glanced at Sakino, and the condition of receiving her soul fragment surprised him. The condition was to make the bearer experience the greatest surprise of his life. However, Ray decided it was worth the risk. He immediately took his dagger in his hand and flew straight at the spider. With one strike of his dagger, Ray was able to cut off one leg of the monster. The spider immediately turned its attention to him and directed its attacks at Ray. The monster swung its huge paw and was about to strike. The spider released so much webbing that there was a light explosion. Sakino covered her face with her hand due to the large amount of dust along with the cobwebs and started screaming and calling for Ray. The girl was very frightened and thought that everything was of course and their last hope was dead. However, Sakino heard Ray turn to the spider and ask him if he really tried to kill it with such force. The girl got very excited. Ray managed to stop the attack of the huge spider with just one hand. The system notified that he was using the Spirit Power skill. The required item to activate the skill was any rank E-Soul fragment. The team members couldn't believe their eyes that Ray had survived and was blocking the boss' one-handed attack. Ray grabbed the monster by its paw and began spinning it around at breakneck speed. And then with an incredible force, he threw the monster back a few meters, forming a rut. The guy immediately approached the monster, and after examining it, said that the weak point of this spider was its abdomen. Ray stabbed his dagger with great force and released a strong energy that flowed through that monster's entire body. The team members began to cheer and shout that Ray had defeated the monster. However, the guy asked why they thought that, since the fight was just beginning. And suddenly at the same moment, a huge amount of red liquid began to come out of the spider's wound. The guild members assumed battle stances and began to shout that this monster had changed its appearance. The spider's wounds healed, its paws turned red, and the monster's aura became much stronger and brighter. The guild members watched the spider rise to its feet. They couldn't understand why it didn't die. After all, the ray had hit it on its weak spot. The spider rose from the ground, its eyes glowing a bright red color, and it was now several times larger. Ray explained to the entire team that the cinnabar spider has 2 stages, and in the second one it becomes much stronger and more ferocious. One of the team members got angry and started asking why Ray hadn't warned them about it sooner. Ray stretched his arm forward and began to use the soul thread skill, saying that they wouldn't be able to do anything with this information anyway. After that, the guy started to fly towards the monster and long golden threads stretched behind him. Ray began to wrap thread around the spider from all sides and prepared his dagger in one hand. He rose above the spider and pulled the threads tighter. The system alerted that the soul sizzling skill could be activated. The required level is 40. Sakino saw what was happening and immediately ordered her team to run for cover as it was dangerous to stay there. Ray raised his hand up and swung his dagger, telling everything around him to blaze with sizzling fire. Flames engulfed the spider boss, and he began to squeak in pain, the fire burning him alive from the inside out. Sakino turned around and couldn't believe he had succeeded. She realized that Ray's fire was much stronger than hers. At this time, Ray calmly stood still and looked at the monster with a serious expression. The happy guild members couldn't be happy that the battle was over and they were all still alive. Suddenly, they noticed a huge block of diamonds. They knew that valuable loot fell out of monsters, but they didn't expect a stone of this size to fall out of the boss. Ray immediately ordered them to stay away from the diamond. The guild members shouted that he was making fun of them, having already taken a lot of money from them, and now he wanted to take the loot for himself. Ray called them idiots, and then Sakino noticed that there were paws sticking out of this gem and moving. Ray explained to them that the boss of the Earth test had turned from an obsidian spider to a vermilion spider, and this is his perfect form. The crew members almost went crazy. They couldn't believe that the monster was still alive. Ray ordered them to stop talking and prepare for battle. The monster used a magic attack and lifted all the people into the air, throwing them in different directions. Sakino tried to keep her balance and warned her team that this monster's attacks on the area had become much faster and more powerful. Ray ran up to her and told her not to get distracted, but to take the squad and get them out of there if they wanted to survive. Sakino asked him what he was going to do. Ray replied that it was obvious he had decided to deal with the monster himself. The monster attacked relentlessly, but Ray dodged each one with incredible speed. He told the girl that in this phase, the boss attacks indiscriminately and won't rest until all the players are killed, and while they have the chance, they should run. Since it's one thing to dodge his attacks, but quite another to overpower him. Ray approached the monster's paw and stabbed with his dagger, tried to cut off the paw. However, there wasn't a scratch on his paw. Ray had assumed that even the infernal dagger was incapable of injuring him, so he decided to hit it at its weakest point. Ray rose above the monster and flew toward it with great speed. The system reported that the soul reserve had been activated. The guild members watched this and couldn't understand what he was doing and if he didn't value his life. Ray stopped above the monster and began to bait it with his aura, waiting for that very moment. At that moment, the monster pierced him with its tentacle, blood splattering in all directions. Ray winced in pain. The guild members were shocked at what they saw. Sakino got scared and started screaming Ray's name. Suddenly, Ray laughed loudly and shouted that caught that monster at last. The spider darted its eyes around in horror and fear, realizing what was about to happen. Ray grabbed his dagger and used the soul-chopping skill. He inflicted thousands of cuts to the monster with just one strike. The spider's body shattered into pieces and scattered in different directions. Ray also began to fall to the ground. With a huge rumble, the stone pieces and Ray's body fell to the ground, forming a pit. An exhausted Ray lay on the ground and thought about the fact that he knew it was going to hurt like hell, but if they didn't heal him, he was definitely going to die. The system alerted that there were 3 seconds left to recover, and if Ray didn't recover his health within that time, his soul protection would be removed and he would die. The guild members gathered around Ray and began to apply higher healing, elemental healing, and restoration. Ray woke up and told Sakina that thanks to her support, he didn't have to use his skills to recover. The guy probed his wound and said that their treatment was certainly excellent. An angry Tsukino asked him if he had planned this all along. Ray looked her in the eye, smiled, and said that they were all playing a game together, after all. And it's not like a player can die so easily from a normal boss attack. Ray continued to smile stupidly. Tsukino got angry at such irresponsibility. She started yelling that they were in reality and it wasn't just a game. Ray replied that he understood, but that the same strategy worked in the game anyway, so it would work in reality. And so it did. Tsukino got even more angry. She almost lost her mind, not understanding at all what this crazy guy was doing. And at that moment, the system alerted that Ray had received a soul fragment of a rank D swordsman. The condition was to make the bearer experience the greatest surprise of his life. Ray took the fragment and thought he was lucky, as it wasn't a surprise, but rather, it put the girl through a shock. After that, the system started to notify that the land test was successfully passed, and it is necessary to specify the name of the participants who passed this test. There are 5 minutes left until the dungeon disappears. The guild members began to jump with happiness that they were able to defeat the boss thanks to Ray. However, Ray interrupted them and said that before the dungeon disappeared, a decision had to be made on who to enter in the field of participants. He also admitted that although he wanted to take the entire award for himself, he suggested that they take it and then transfer it to his account afterward. Tsukino was greatly surprised and asked why it was Ray who needed them to specifically transfer the reward to him. Then Ray said to them to just imagine how the news would explode with the news that a test that no one could pass was able to be overcome by an unknown player. And instead, it's easier to say that a famous guild handled the challenge. Then the guild will get glory and honor, and the rewards for the next trials will be hung up as well. In fact, Ray realized that if everyone found out he was involved, he wouldn't be able to make money so easily anymore. Tsukino asked him if he was just worried about money. And as the head of the guild, she can't refuse something like that. But as a human being, she feels like she's appropriating someone else's credit. Ray replied that she wasn't appropriating anything for herself, and she could consider hiring him to subdue the boss for 1 billion. Tsukino agreed, and they agreed that they would announce that it was the Wings of Creation Guild that had passed the test. The system alerted that the record of the participants had been successfully saved. Ray could only hope that no one in the room would reveal his involvement in the test. After all, it's comparable to accusing your own guild of stealing laurels from a poor newbie. The ground test was successfully passed. However, a short time later, a media helicopter flew over the burning forest. The girl correspondent reported through the device that the earthquake has been going on since the morning, and the epicenter was identified underground. The atmosphere was heated. The girl reported that the dungeon was being destroyed, and very soon the players would be teleported to the surface. At this time, rocks were falling on the players in the dungeon. To them, they tried to be extremely careful as everything around them collapsed. Suddenly, a magic circle appeared above them, attracting all the players like a magnet, pulling them to the surface. The system notified that the test had passed, and everyone was being teleported. All the guys were extremely relieved and happy to be heading towards the circle to get out of the dungeon sooner. Finally, the players got outside. They started jumping with happiness and rejoicing in the sunlight. They were able to breathe in the fresh air. Ray also breathed a sigh of relief, and at that moment, a huge monument appeared from the dungeon. Tsukino took one look at that and said happily that they really were able to pull off such a difficult task. On this huge monument was an engraving that the test of the land had been passed by a group of heroes from the Wings of Creation Guild. The reporters and correspondents started running towards the guild like mad. It was a big sensation that the test had been passed. They couldn't wait to talk to these heroes. The reporters surrounded the guild members on all sides and shouted that here was this very group that had participated in the conquest. Sakino looked at what was going on and said that journalists don't even sleep. After that, she turned around. She turned to Ray, asking if he was sure about their arrangement. However, Ray was no longer there, and no one had seen where he had disappeared to. Suddenly, one of the team members handed the girl a note and said that Ray had passed this on for her. Sakino read the note, which said that if they had any problems and money on hand, they could contact Ray and he would solve any issue. At this time, journalists kept me busy with their questions. They wondered if Japan was safe now. Who struck the final blow? Who managed to defeat the boss? One of the guys started to get aggressive and yelled for the reporters to get off their backs. However, Sakino asked him to calm down and told him that she would handle it. Sakino stepped forward and made an announcement to the citizens of Japan. She proudly announced the happy news that they, the members of the Wings of Creation Guild, were able to pass the test of the land. However, Sakino continued her speech and said that this merit did not belong to their guild alone, namely, that conquering the dungeon was only possible through the combined effort of all the players. At that time, Cookie pulled up and told Ray that his car was served. Ray smiled and replied that they were right on time. Sakino continued her speech, saying that she takes this opportunity to thank all those players who weren't afraid of the dungeon and risked their lives. The reporters were very moved by such a speech. They admired Sakino's modesty and said that this was how the head of the Wings of Creation Guild was. Ray, meanwhile, was riding in the car and thinking about the fact that Sakino got what she wanted, and he didn't care about popularity. Ray's main concern was that the money would end up in his hands. Too much attention would cause more trouble than good. Ray's insidious thoughts were that Sakino was the perfect candidate for his face that he could use to cover himself when necessary. After his musings, Ray said he was hungry and asked that Cookie stop somewhere. Meanwhile, breaking news was being broadcast on all channels. It was reported that Japan was no longer in danger of annihilation, since the Earth test has been successfully passed by the members of the Wings of Creation Guild. And Japan is the second country, after the US, that managed to pass the test and keep the country together. A short while later, Ray, sitting in his office, received a notification of a 1 billion yen transfer. Ray's team members heard about the transfer of such a huge amount of money. However, they realized that they should definitely not count on this money. They were going through and masking coins, and one of the guys asked what they were even doing and why they were doing all this. Another of the team shut him up and told him not to ask stupid questions, because if Ray said it, it had to be so. At this moment, Ray called out to the girl Rumi and asked her how his guild's gold farm registration was going. Rumi approached and reported that the registration was successfully completed. However, she hesitantly asked why Ray had made the decision to have her as the head of the guild. Ray smiled and replied that the thing was that only players with rank B or higher could create their own guild, and he's rank E, so that function is not available to him. Rumi became agitated and said that there are still people better suited for the role. Ray looked her in the eye and told her that he had made that choice in her favor because she was the right person for the position. Thanks to Ray, all the members of the Gold Farm Guild were able to raise their ranks to B and even higher. Each member of the guild has their own pros and cons. Although Rumi's earnings are not good, her pluses are that she is very diligent and friendly. And so Ray decided that she was the perfect guild leader. At this time, Cookie came over and said that they were already being discussed all over the internet. A bunch of articles have been written about the fact that there is a new guild gold farm, where all members with rank B and above, as well as interviews with the head of the guild. Ray chuckled and said that it was a good thing he had assigned himself the position of head of the office. Cookie wondered why Ray needed a guild, since he could make a lot of money on his own. Ray replied that the main goal is to get as many orders for information as possible, because the world is not only shaken by catastrophes like trials that affect the whole country, and some trials are more localized, affecting only a certain town or village, and accordingly, only the guild can receive orders to complete such trials. At this time, Rumi came over and announced that they had made a list of all the easier trials with worthy rewards. However, Ray handed her the letter and told her that they would deal with the ordeal first. Rumi looked at it, and her eyes became like balloons. It said a trial in a European-style mansion and a reward of $5 million. She said that given the complexity, they could find orders where they would be paid a lot more. Cookie was surprised, since Rumi had previously been willing to take any job, but now she was starting to care about money. However, Rumi said that if Ray had noticed the ordeal, it meant that the mansion could hold something else besides money. Ray replied that it was. Ray looked the girl straight in the eyes, and his aura became visible. He told her that this was an opportunity they shouldn't miss. After a while, Ray was driving in his car, and suddenly he received a call from Rumi. Rumi reported that the set assignment was intercepted by their guild, and they managed to negotiate a reward of 5 million yen. Ray replied that this was great news and that he would be on site in 30 minutes. Suddenly, the other phone on the car seat started ringing, and that got Ray's attention. Ray answered the call. It was Yuji. He reported that he had arrived at the indicated position and strange people had entered the house. Ray asked how many people were there, and if they had discovered Yuji. The guy answered that there were 5 of them, and they hadn't noticed him. Ray then said he'd handle the rest himself, and told the guy to get out of there. Yuji was listed in Ray's phone as Golden Hamster number 2. Ending the conversation, Ray wondered what the other players had forgotten there, since the request had been intercepted by his guild. Therefore, he decided to use an illusionary mask to avoid shining his face unnecessarily. The system alerted that to create the item illusionary mask, materials were needed. Ray remembered that he had gotten the soul fragment of a rank D swordsman from Tsukino. After all, the system immediately reported that the probability of success of creating an illusionary mask using a rank D swordsman soul fragment was 0.23%. Ray then asked what if the item was created manually? The system replied that the probability of success in such a case was unknown, and if Ray failed while creating the item, he would suffer physical or mental consequences. The system asked if Ray was ready to create the item manually, and of course he said yes. And at the same second, the system announced that the transition to the Soul Forge had begun, and also that Ray needs to harmonize his soul with the subject, and the likelihood of success depends on how he handles this task. And since the base success rate is below 1%, the difficulty will be increased. The time limit is 60 minutes. Ray immediately got to work. He was shifting and connecting the pieces like puzzles, and he did it with incredible speed. The system reported that time is up and the soul is in perfect harmony. The probability of success is 100%. The transition to the real world is performed. The illusory mask was made thanks to the skill of the Soul Smith subclass. Ray was perfectly happy with the mask and told him to stop the car as it was time for him to get out. He got out of the car, put on a mask, and now people will see him as a different person. Ray walked up to the very huge mansion they had been contracted for. He went inside and saw a pile of corpses. They had been set on fire, and the smell of burning still hung in the air. Ray walked past them and down the stairs, thinking that it looked like he was already expected downstairs. As he descended to the lowest point, he noticed that the hidden door was open. Ray realized that they were looking for a hidden test. Depending on the complexity, trials are divided into large-scale and small-scale trials. Large-scale ones are those that involve an entire state. Small-scale ones involve small communities like towns and villages. Well, it is logical to assume that small-scale tests are not so complicated. Hence, you can't raise a lot of money on them. But even among them, there are exceptions, hidden trials. They arise only in small-scale trials, in secluded corners. Their level of difficulty is much higher than that of small-scale tests, and usually has nothing to do with the main test. The best part of these challenges is that you can get rare items. In other words, these challenges can only be found by those who have information about the game. Meanwhile, Ray found another staircase and began to descend even lower. Here he met a team of people dressed in black clothing. They noticed Ray, and one of them took off his hood and asked if Ray was a representative from the Gold Farm Guild. Ray was surprised and replied that he didn't know what the gold farm was. Then the man apologized and said that he was mistaken, and afterward told Ray that he could see that he was capable of passing this hidden test. Ray gave him a sullen look and said that he had no intention of undergoing the hidden test for their sake. The man smiled and replied that Ray had misunderstood and that it wasn't necessary at all. And then Ray didn't understand anything at all. Then the man showed him the box and said that the test had already been passed, asking if Ray had come for the evolutionary box. Ray wondered if they had really passed the test, and wondered if he really needed the box. At that very second, the man threw the box right into Ray's hands and said that as a token of their appreciation, they were giving it to him. However, in return, they asked to fulfill their request. Ray asked what exactly they were asking for. The man smiled and replied that Ray needed to keep other people from going through a small-scale trial, and it didn't matter how he did it. He also said that if Ray is an experienced player, he should definitely know how to thwart others. Ray wondered why these people would want to prevent him from passing the test. Suddenly, he said he realized who they were. Ray asked that are they really the Dark Guild and want to set up the same thing that happened to Argentina? It happened 2 weeks ago. One of the cities in Argentina, specifically Mendoza, was completely destroyed because no one could pass a simple test. But the whole problem happened a week ago. Shares of companies that were based in Mendoza underwent massive short selling across the board. It was as if someone knew in advance that Mendoza would be wiped off the face of the earth for good. Ray told the man that there was talk that the Dark Guild was to blame. He asked if they'd had enough of Argentina and now they were going after Japan. And then the man told Ray that he could continue to fantasize about the reasons for their proposal, but asked him to answer whether Ray agreed or not. Ray looked him in the eye and replied that he was declining, no matter how tempting their offer sounded. And if it were to choose which one of them would destroy the city, it would be far more profitable for Ray to do it himself than to serve someone else. Then the man replied that it was a great pity and held out his hand and demanded the box back. Also, Ray would have to pay a small percentage for the time he held that box in his hands. Ray asked, "What other percentage?" And then the man looked at him angrily and replied that the interest was in the form of his life. He pulled a syringe of unknown liquid from his pocket and told Ray that he had only 2 choices: either cooperate obediently or die. Ray immediately drew his sword and asked if they really thought they could overpower him. The man replied that in a normal situation they would hardly have succeeded, but they had somehow managed to pass this secret test. After saying that, he stuck a syringe in his neck and the rest of his team did the same. He said that Ray would feel their power on him, and that the player's skills are useless in front of the incredible, powerful force of the Darkest Guild. As soon as the players injected syringes into their necks, their aura turned dark purple, their eyes shining with a bright light. Ray watched their transformation from the sidelines and assumed they were doping. Ray knew that doping affected physical performance, but outwardly they remained the same. However, he didn't understand why they were standing still. Then Ray looked at the box and realized what was wrong. He smiled and decided to play along. Ray then shook the box a few times, and the team leader immediately pulled out a remote and pressed a button. The box exploded. The members of the Dark Guild immediately started laughing loudly and said that Ray was a real idiot if he fell for such a simple trick. And in general, all players are like that. They believe that due to game mechanics they became an imba, but remained too naive. The ringleader moved closer to the explosion and kept talking. All he had to do was divert attention to a possible threat and blow up the box. He even felt sorry for Ray. However, he immediately dismissed those thoughts and said that they didn't need such useless ones anyway. At this time, the smoke from the explosion had already cleared, and he noticed that Ray's body was gone and the box was lying on the floor. No one could understand what had happened or where Ray had gone. At the same moment, Ray began to massacre the team members. He used destructive fire and began to burn them alive. The leader noticed that Ray was using an illusionary mask. After dealing with everyone, Ray approached the ringleader, taking off his mask, and said he felt sorry for his friends. After saying those words, he used the soul-capturing skill, and the chain shackled the ringleader in that very second, preventing him from moving. The ringleader kept yelling that it was impossible and asked how Ray managed to survive such an explosion. Ray smiled and replied that he was well aware of the value of the box, and certainly didn't believe they had given it away out of the goodness of their hearts. He went to the box, picked it up, and said that it was clear from the beginning that it was booby-trapped. Tormenting himself in chains, the ringleader asked why Ray had picked it up then if he knew it was booby-trapped. Ray started laughing and said that they had underestimated the high-level players, and for them, the blast from such a small bomb was like a breeze in the face. After saying that, Ray started calling Rumi. He told the leader that he would take the money from his wallet for the ruined clothes. The ringleader became frightened and started yelling that it was wrong for Ray to call the police. Ray smiled and replied that he was making the call on a much more important matter. Rumi answered the phone and cheerfully asked if Ray had already handled the test. However, Ray told her to look at the regions in Japan that were buying up shares with more fervor. After all, it was possible that the Dark Guild was doing the same thing to their country as they were doing to Argentina. Rumi immediately set to work, and Ray said that they must not let the tragedy repeat itself. The ringleader at this time started laughing loudly and told Ray that he was a straight-up hero of justice. Ray smiled and replied that he was talking nonsense. After all, the Dark Guild was deliberately collapsing the sales of local companies' stocks by selling them cheaply. And if Ray's people buy them out and he passes the test, how much money will Ray get as if out of thin air? The ringleader got angry and asked if Ray was thinking of going to war against the Dark Guild. Ray replied that if there was a lot of money at stake, he would be more than happy to, or they could cooperate with them. The ringleader got even more angry and asked what kind of idiot would cooperate with him. Ray called Rumi and asked if the re-education course was ready. Rumi clarified, the same one that would require a character with re-education. Ray said that was it. Then Rumi said that everything was ready, but they had not yet conducted experiments and did not know how effective such methods would be. Ray smiled and said that he would be delivering the lab rats to them soon, so preparations must be made. After that, Ray opened the box, and the system reported that thanks to the evolution box item, the F-rank mage soul fragment had turned into an E-rank mage soul fragment. Sometime later, Ray, using an illusionary mask, arrived at the Museum of Modern Art. He called Rumi and asked if she was sure that was the purpose of the Dark Guild. Rumi replied that it was accurate information since the ringleader and the rest of the Dark Guild members had confessed to it. However, Rumi said that they unfortunately didn't know how many enemies would be in the territory, and maybe he shouldn't have gone alone. Ray replied that he would figure it out. Ray went inside and ordered that Rumi continue to monitor the stock and let him know if anything happened. A crowd of people had gathered outside the museum, and in the very center, Ray spotted a guy named Takashi. He was putting an ad on the internet, saying he was looking for a group to conquer. No rewards implied. They had to protect the city together. Takashi shouted that if anyone is interested in participating in the trial, they're free to join. He is the leader of an association for the protection of humanity. Ray noticed that there were quite a few people gathered, over 100 for sure. Takashi continued to speak his moving speech. It was hard for him to convey his feelings of admiration and pride at how many people had come to defend the city. He thanked each and every one of them. Ray was among the crowd and couldn't believe that so many people had gone to such an ordeal without reward. He assumed that a spy could easily have been in the crowd. Ray wondered if he should find the spy before going inside. He'd already applied the soul eye, but there, Takashi started shouting that it was time to start the trial. He told everyone not to be afraid and to call for help if they encountered a strong enemy, as the association staff would help everyone. Ray was surprised that they had absolutely no strategy, and this Takashi was talking such nonsense. However, Ray thought it was only to his advantage. In fact, Ray had already guessed exactly who the spy would turn out to be, but he hadn't yet figured out how to deal with them in the end. Of the 107 players who took part in the challenge, all 106 participants turned out to be spies from the Dark Guild, with the exception of one Ray. Takashi was actively escorting everyone inside the museum, reminding them of caution and safety. All the players went inside. Ray looked around and thought he looked very expensive. At that same moment, Ray noticed that all the players began to surround him from different directions, holding spray cans in their hands. And suddenly, all the players simultaneously started releasing gas and canisters directly at Ray, forming a huge explosion. However, Ray knew about this trap from the beginning, so he managed to fly upwards above the focus of the explosion. And right after that, Ray descended to the ground, killing everyone who had organized that explosion. There was no chance for them to escape. Having disposed of all of them, Ray said that they were very docile and fearless dogs, blindly raring to fight, not caring about the superiority of their opponent. At the same second Takashi burst into the hall, he ran frantically and screamed, not realizing what had happened. Ray replied that all these people suddenly attacked him, and he had to calm them down. Takashi said it was some kind of horror and misunderstanding. He asked how Ray was feeling and if he was hurt. And immediately after he said that, he drew his dagger and prepared to strike. However, Ray instantly grabbed that knife with 2 fingers. Takashi couldn't move and didn't understand what kind of strength Ray had. Meanwhile, Ray threw him back a couple meters and told him that his weapon wasn't even a game item, and Takashi wouldn't hurt any player with it. At that moment, the rest of the surviving comrades ran up to Takashi. Ray looked at them and said that this farce was unnecessary since he knew they were all affiliated with the Dark Guild. Takashi smiled evilly and replied that since Ray knew everything, it was even easier. The other players heard this and asked Takashi, "What other Dark Guild is there? And didn't the order for this trial come from an environmental protection group?" Takashi started laughing and replied that that was correct. And the Environmental Protection Group is a business partner of the Dark Guild. After that, Takashi spread his hands and suggested that everyone just discuss things quietly. He then looked into Ray's eyes and said that their priority was not to kill him, but to protect this place, and he would hate to become enemies. And also, if Ray agrees to cooperate, Takashi will arrange for him to be paid an allowance of 50K, maybe 100K. When the players heard this, they started shouting with discontent that he was offered 100,000 and they were only offered 30,000. And some of them heard about any fee for the first time at all. It made sense to Ray now, and in the past he would have likely fallen for such a scam too, but this time he has to decline. Takashi was surprised that Ray turned him down and said it was a shame, since now he would have to finish him off. After saying that, Takashi turned to the players and said that he had a special offer. Only now, whoever kills Ray will get 100,000 on top. The players started running towards Ray at that very second, saying that they would destroy him. However, once they got as close to Ray as possible, he effortlessly used a technique and disarmed them. Upon seeing this, Takashi lashed out at Ray, saying that he was the former head of the judo club and Ray couldn't beat him. Ray turned around and disarmed the daredevil with 1 knee strike. Takashi slumped to the floor. Ray immediately applied the soul-capturing skill, binding him with chains. Takashi couldn't move and screamed in pain. After that, Ray turned around and noticed 2 players hiding. They began to beg Ray not to kill them. Ray figured they might know something about the Dark Guild, and it would be foolish not to take advantage of it. So he told them that he would not kill them if they cooperated. At that moment, Ray called Rumi and told her that he had great news. They would now have 100 new co-guildmates. Rumi was surprised and asked that they now had to undergo re-education too. She warned that few of the 100 would be able to endure it. Ray replied that they were just ordinary rookies, and there was no need to re-educate them. But one head of the Association for the Protection of Humanity definitely needed their courses. And suddenly at that moment, a sword shining with a dark purple aura flew at Ray. However, Ray noticed the attack in time and managed to fly up and dodge such a powerful blow. After that, Ray landed, smiled, and looked at the balcony, saying that he was finally out. A stranger with a mask on his face stood on the balcony and asked how long ago Ray had noticed him. Ray replied that he had noticed from the moment he arrived. After all the players who had come were just extras. And Ray also said that the stranger really stood out among these weaklings, and no matter how hard he tried to hide his powers, everyone else just paled in comparison. The stranger wondered how Ray was able to spot him so easily. He drew his two shining swords and pounced on Ray with incredible speed, asking if he could survive a fight against him. They faced off in an uneasy battle, Ray anticipating every attack and blocking it. The stranger was surprised and said that Ray was much stronger than he was in the game, as he parried his blows with a single dagger. Ray was confused as to how the stranger would know what he was like in a game, so he slashed his mask with a single swipe of his dagger. The mask fell off the stranger's face, and Ray recognized the man. He never thought he'd meet someone he'd spent time with in the game before the crash. Ray called him by his first name, Yudo, and said he was glad to meet him. Yudo replied that he was sorry it had happened under these circumstances, since he would have to cut off Ray's life anyway. After saying that, Yudo took a pose to attack. Ray, meanwhile, took the mask off his face and asked if Yudo had the strength to cut his life short. Yudo used the activation of the two-blade skill at the same second and started yelling that Ray was leaving him no choice. With incredible speed, he attacked Ray and managed to wound him in the shoulder. Ray recognized that Yudo's skill was really good, but not better than his own. After saying that, Ray activated the Soul Eye skill, and after analyzing it, he found out that his main class was Swordsman with two blades, and there was no subclass. Therefore, Ray realized that the duration of Yudo's super speed, given his level, would soon shorten and Yudo would run out of steam. The battle continued. Ray caught his opponent's momentum and delivered one powerful blow that sent Yudo crashing to the ground, forming a hole underneath him. Afterward, Ray came down to him and told him that Yudo was strong, but his weapons weren't, and he wouldn't cut his life short with those swords. Ray then used the soul-capturing skill again and stilled Yudo in chains. Yudo tried to break free and couldn't understand what was going on. After all, for the soul-capturing skill to work, they must have a difference in levels. Ray smiled and replied that he was absolutely right, and they had a colossal difference in levels. However, afterward, Ray said that Yudo was one of the best players he knew, and so he offered him to join him, as he would make millions with him, and the Dark Guild was not capable of that. Through the pain, Yudo replied that he couldn't. Ray was surprised and asked why that was so. Yudo replied that he couldn't tell. Then Ray said he should tighten his chains. Yudo screamed in pain from hell that he couldn't tell, and if he did, he'd have to tell. Ray told him to keep quiet and keep talking, but Yudo didn't give up. Then Ray asked him where Hashi was right now. Yudo almost cried at that moment. At one time, the game discouraged potential players with its complexity. It was not easy for casuals to survive, especially when it came to dungeons. So in this game, it was important to have strong comrades who shared the same outlook on the game. Yudo and his younger brother, Hashi, were such companions. The bosses that Ray could easily kill alone, the three of them chopped them down. But when their level difference became too different, they stopped playing together. But Ray kept his contacts in the game. Meanwhile, the guys cooled down and sat down to talk quietly. Yudo said that he hadn't expected to meet Ray under these circumstances. Ray asked where Hashi was being held after all. Yudo lowered his head and said that he didn't know and that he wasn't even allowed to see him. Suddenly, Yudo fell to his knees and began to beg for Ray to find out where they were keeping him, since Ray has the Soul Smith subclass, and he's capable of doing it. Ray sighed and replied that he had that skill, but no longer in the game, but in the real world. He then stood up, walked over to a large expensive painting, and continued his speech that now only money motivated him to work. Ray then turned to Yudo, held out his hand, and said that he would have to empty the entire contents out of his wallet. Yudo was as shocked as possible. He put his head down and cried, begging for Ray to save his brother. Ray then asked if he had his brother's personal items with him. Yudo pulled out Hashi's cap and gave it to Ray. Ray applied the Soul Search skill and designated Hashi as the target. The system immediately reported that the target was not detected because the target was already dead. Hearing this, Yudo almost went crazy. He fell to the floor and started screaming that it was impossible. The system also reported that the target killer was Raven. Yudo clenched his hand into a fist and said that he would kill the creep. Ray asked if he knew the man. Yudo replied that he was the one who had taken his brother hostage and forced Yudo to work for the Dark Guild. Yudo's aura glowed with a dark color. He became extremely angry and started shouting that he would kill this animal with his own hands. Afterward, he fell to his knees in front of Ray and promised that he would make as much money as Ray wanted, just so he could help avenge his brother. Ray said that he too was hurt by the news of his Sashi's passing, as he too was like a little brother to him. Yudo looked at him with eyes full of tears and said that then they could go for revenge together. However, Ray passed him by and replied that he didn't have time for that, as money wouldn't make itself. Yudo asked for him to stop, and at that moment, Ray got messages on his phone from Tsukino. She asked if Ray had really fought the Dark Guild of the museum, and how he had even agreed to such a thing, and who had paid him. Ray was greatly surprised by such messages and couldn't understand where Tsukino was getting his information about him from. He texted her that it was his personal initiative and asked if there was an order for him. Tsukino replied that the government was looking for people to destroy the Dark Guild's base. The reward is 1 billion yen. Ray was surprised that they were offering 1 billion for a routine elimination, so he asked how she knew about it. Tsukino replied that the government had personally requested the help of the Wings of Creation Guild, so Ray needed to keep the information regarding this mission secret. Ray then asked why she was sharing this information with him, if it was a secret. Tsukino got angry and wrote that he wasn't a stranger to her. And Tsukino also said that there were rumors that the guild headquarters held assets worth over 10 billion yen. And if the order could be fulfilled, the government would keep quiet that there was something there. Ray turned to Yudo at the same second and asked if he was aware that Raven might be at the Dark Guild headquarters right now. Yudo was surprised and replied that of course, since Raven was the head of the Japanese branch of the Dark Guild, it was unlikely that he had ever left his abode. Ray smiled widely and replied that there was a change of plans and he would help Yudo avenge his brother. And at that very second, Ray sent a message to Tsukino that the Gold Farm Guild would take this order. And so after some time, Ray, along with Yudo, set out to find the headquarters of the Dark Guild. Suddenly, Ray received a message from Tsukino. She wrote that the local police had found the Dark Guild's base, and they were on their way. Ray asked her if their base was on the 12th floor. Tsukino was surprised and asked where Ray got that information from, since they had just gotten that information from the government. Ray wrote that he was personally investigating the Dark Guild, and now he's headed there. In that case, Tsukino asked that Ray help the police since he was already going there, because if the Dark Guild fought back, the police wouldn't be able to handle it. Ray immediately asked what the price was. Tsukino offered 1 million per person for the safety of the Dark Guild members, and also for the safety of the police officers, 1 million per person. Tsukino also promised to discuss these terms with the government, but if refused, the Guild of the Wings of Creation would take payment. Ray agreed to those terms. Ray decided to inform Yudo that the local police were also heading to the Dark Guild's base. Yudo, of course, rejoiced at such news and suggested that they should hurry over to their place sooner rather than later. However, Ray said that he would go alone and for Yudo to wait here, since the Dark Guild doesn't know yet if Yudo is alive or not. Therefore, Ray decided to hide this fact from them and take them by surprise. Yudo realized the seriousness of this operation and agreed, promising that he would be waiting on the spot. As an admonishment, Yudo asked that Ray be careful, because if the police found them, the guild could set traps all over the building. Ray replied that he would keep that in mind. After a while, Ray approached the building where the base was located. However, the building was completely sealed off and no one was allowed to enter. However, that didn't stop Ray. He lifted the tape and wanted to climb over, but a man stopped him and said that due to a gas leak, the passage to the building was temporarily sealed. Ray replied that the Guild of the Wings of Creation had personally asked him to join in the capture of the target, and asked if he had the wrong address. The man immediately apologized for his rudeness and led Ray in the right direction. He led Ray to a room where negotiations between serious men in business suits were actively taking place, and said that a player from the Wings of Creation Guild had arrived. One of the men immediately became aggressive and yelled that no backup was requested. He also looked Ray upside down and said that the slob wouldn't be any use anyway, and they'd handle it themselves. He then turned his back to Ray, and, turning around, said that he was connected to the people at the top, so his orders were absolute, and that Ray dare not interfere. The man led a whole squad of police officers and gave them orders for them all to go forward. Ray watched from the sidelines and told one of the attendees that this was a bad idea. A few seconds later, there was an explosion on the top floor. Debris started falling on them, and Ray said he had warned them. So Ray had to take matters into his own hands. He used the soul thread skill and blocked their floor so that the debris wouldn't collapse and the fire wouldn't continue. The man's eyes stopped in front of his eyes at the debris that was flying at him. He couldn't believe they were saved. Ray then looked around the area and decided it was worth it to save the very male fool and the police officers. He flew in their direction. Ray landed and found the police officers lying motionless on the floor. He thought he was too late. However, at that moment, Ray heard the man coughing and realized that he could still help them. Ray looked at him and said that one man's life was worth 1,000,000 yen, and it would be a waste if he died here. After saying that, Ray wrapped a golden thread around all the police officers and began to pull them out of there, lowering them to the ground. Ray did his thing and said that there was nothing more to do here, and he had to go. The people around him thanked him and couldn't understand who this player was. After a while, Ray came to Yudo and said that he was done with all the chores. Yudo was eating ice cream and said that he had somehow gotten through it quickly. Yudo also handed Ray his favorite tea and asked how it went. Ray replied that the Dark Guild had already escaped and he had only wasted his time. He then stuck a pipe into the tea bag and asked that maybe the Dark Guild had some other base. Yudo replied that he was only aware of one base and had no further information. And also Yudo said that the items the guild lent him, as well as the smartphone, he threw away the same day he met Ray. And they can certainly go back to the museum trial and pick up at least a phone to get some information. Ray said it wasn't worth it, though, because then their location would be known. And besides, Ray already knew what to do. The guys continued on their way, and Ray said that it was hard to do criminal business and organize a hideout when you were at gunpoint with the police, and especially when there are cameras all over the city that can easily reveal the identity of any passerby. Then Yudo asked that consequently, the Dark Guild would choose a place with minimal cameras and hard to find. And under this description, some dungeon with low level to pass and low reward would fit perfectly. Ray replied that that was correct, and he had already instructed his army of money hamsters to look for such a place. Yudo was surprised and didn't understand what army he was talking about. Ray rolled his eyes and explained that he was talking about his guild gold farm. He also added that Yudo would of course be part of that team as well. And for that, he would need to work hard and bring in millions. Yudo replied that Ray was not at all ceremonious about it. Suddenly, Yudo had a question asking if they needed to call his army for backup. Ray replied that it was not necessary. They also have busy schedules and completely different tasks. At this time, the golden hamsters finished disguising the coins, and Ray told Yudo that if he summoned them, he would disrupt their schedule and reduce his profits. At the same second, Ray received a message from the team that there were only 36 dungeons recorded in a month that no one could enter, and 7 of them were in nearby Tokyo neighborhoods. And the only closed dungeon with constantly regenerating monsters is the Tower of Carnage, located deep in the mountains of Chiba Prefecture. The dungeon is located deep in the mountains in the Tower of Carnage. Ray realized that a dungeon where enemies eventually revive was the perfect place for a base. And given the difficulty level of the dungeon itself and the low level of the enemies, no special levels or items can be gained there. The dungeon is a place they wouldn't even think of going to, even given its dislocation. Ray told Yudo that they have to go there. Yudo replied that everything was already in place for that, since Ray had asked to take care of it himself, knowing that it wouldn't be a long journey. Yudo then pointed to one of the parked cars and said that this baby would survive the mountain roads safely. The guys got in the car, and Ray told Yudo to drive faster and not to worry about speeding tickets, since he would solve everything. Hearing such words from Ray, Yudo happily stomped full speed, and the car almost flew into the sky. Ray calmly sipped his tea and said that they shouldn't let them leave this time. Yudo replied that he was damn right. The boys continued on their way and were already out of town. The road was quite long. Ray navigated the guidebook and told Yudo to go straight ahead. Yudo replied that there was no further road and asked if he should continue. Ray said he would handle it and ordered Yudo to drive carefully and keep his speed up. Ray put on his illusionary mask and Yudo hit the gas. The car soared over the cliff. Then the car landed on a rocky road, and such a jolt made Ray's tea fall out of his hands, and Yudo was having fun with such adrenaline. Ray used his skill and formed a defense around the car. They continued to roll downhill and even knocked over a tree in their path. Finally, they stopped, and Yudo said they seemed to have a flat tire. Ray got angry and said that he had told him to be careful. Yudo winked and replied that the enemy wouldn't notice them at the foot of the mountain. And besides, he had such a ride at his disposal. Yudo just couldn't help but make the most of it. The boys got out of the car and noticed a huge, beautiful building on top of the mountain. Ray wasted no time and slung his backpack on his back to continue on his way. Yudo walked forward, but Ray stopped him and asked him if he had forgotten anything. Yudo took a deep breath and said that it was cruel to carry heavy luggage after driving like that. However, Yudo had no choice. Ray said that the backpacks contained weapons, since the two of them were going up against an entire organization, and they needed to have an arsenal with them. The boys climbed up the rocky mountain, and after a while the system reported that they had arrived at the Tower of Carnage. Ray, along with Yudo, hid behind the trees to assess the situation at the tower gate. They noticed that there were 5 armed guards at the gate, but they did not exclude the possibility that there were others nearby. The guards were smoking cigars and discussing that it would be a good idea if a woman were brought to them now. But no girl would come to a place like this. One of the guards started laughing and said that even if some idiot showed up there, he would do anything to him since he no longer had the strength to endure it. The guards all started laughing loudly, and Ray asked what kind of scum they'd recruited for security. Yudo said that he had seen those idiots at the last base. Ray replied that that meant their assumption was correct. Ray also said that they could attack them right now and check with Yudo about their security situation. Yudo said that the past base was disguised as an office that was rented in a multi-story building, but this one is different. Ray looked around the area and noticed that the bridges to this dungeon were all destroyed and the dungeon itself was shrouded in a barrier. The only way in was through a gate. That's why they put strong soldiers at the gate, because by guarding the gates, you can completely protect yourself from intruders from outside. However, Yudo said not to relax, as in addition to the guards at the gate, there might be others nearby, and at the last base, it was an entire hidden unit of 30 people. Ray then clarified how strong this unit could be. Yudo replied that it was no stronger than them. But as far as he knows, there are 3 players in the Dark Guild who are equal to or even stronger than Yudo. Their names are Jack, Kuroki, and Raven. Yudo visibly became nervous and said with a cold sweat on his forehead that these 3 would be the hardest to deal with. Ray smiled and replied that it would be even more fun with 3 players of equal strength. Yudo looked at Ray with relief and said that since Ray was so optimistic, he was relying on him. Ray said it would be a shame if that trio ran away while they were fighting these little brats, since there's a 1,000,000 yen reward for 1 Dark Guild member, so it's advisable to block the exit to avoid losing profits. Yudo asked in surprise that did Ray really come here for money. Ray replied that it couldn't be otherwise. However, Ray added that it wasn't just about the money, as if they didn't block that exit, the criminals might get away, including Raven. After saying those words, rage swept over Yudo. He said that they needed to block the exit by any means necessary so that no creature would slip through. Ray agreed and said that the Wings of Creation could be enlisted for backup. However, if one were to contact Tsukino directly, there's a chance that the Dark Guild might find out about their plans. Then Yudo said that he would have to hold them back until the Guild of Creation Wings arrived, and asked Ray if the 2 of them could handle it. Ray smiled widely, looked him in the eye, and said so Yudo didn't even doubt it. Ray then wrote a message to Tsukino that he had discovered the second base of the Dark Guild. It was urgent to send the strongest players who could help in the blockade. And also the fact that there might be a spy of the Dark Guild in Sakino's guild could not be ruled out. So Ray asked her to send only those she trusts as herself. Ray then said that after sending the message, they could begin. Yudo took a pose to attack. Ray started the countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, and on the count of 1, Ray pressed send. Yudo activated the super speed skill at the same second. Yudo flew up to the guards and started disarming them one by one. The guards couldn't even realize what was happening. After straightening everyone out, Yudo said that this heavy backpack had reduced his speed. Then he looked at Ray and said that in that case, he couldn't equals T blame him for being slow. Ray threw off his backpack and told Yudo not to whine as it was time to pull out their weapons. He opened the backpack, picked it up, and started spinning at an incredible speed. Thousands of those same disguise coins spilled out of the backpack. Ray then sighed and said that everything was ready. All that was left was to wait for them to come out. A security camera spotted Ray and Yudo and alerted them that there were intruders on the premises and they needed to be eliminated. Many soldiers immediately ran out of the tower. Yudo grabbed his backpack, and Ray said, "Here comes his millions of yen running straight into his hands." This amused Ray a lot. He looked at Yudo and said that it was time to earn money. Ray then activated the coin blast skill. There was an explosion that caused the soldiers to start burning. Ray looked at it and said that just as he thought, the weak explosion made everyone fall immediately. Some managed to survive. One of them warned the others to be careful, as they could not see anything because of the smoke and the enemy could attack at any moment. At that same second, Ray threw a punch and said with a smile that they were very savvy boys. He then looked at Yudo and said that he was doing pretty well and had already destroyed 10, and one of those was worth $1 million. Yudo smiled broadly and replied that he was just getting started and the most fun was just ahead. However, at that moment, Ray was attacked from behind by one of the warriors. Yudo started yelling that there was an attack from behind. However, before Ray could even blink, Yudo had already cut the enemy apart, saving Ray. Yudo then turned around and said Ray had spotted the enemy and was purposely standing there waiting for Yudo to finish him off. Ray replied that he guessed correctly and pointed to the camera, saying that he didn't want to put on a show and reveal all the trump cards to them. And also Ray asked not to be called by his name, as there might be a microphone on the camera, and if there's no microphone, they can still read lips. Then the guys looked around, and Ray said they had done enough and it was time to take away their view. After saying that, he destroyed the surveillance camera. At this time, the guild leader and the others were watching what Ray had done. Raven, the head of the Japanese branch of the Dark Guild, asked his subordinates that they had come after all. The girl told him that one of the attackers was Yudo, a mouse and a traitor to their organization, and the identity of the other attacker was unknown. One of those present said that they were running the identity of the other through the databases of the Japanese Adventurers Association, but so far no data had been found. Raven realized that if one of them was Yudo, he had learned of his younger brother's death, so he betrayed them. Raven thought for a moment and said that all Yudo and his brother were doing was getting in their way. He suddenly recalled a moment from the past when he had assigned his younger brother a special mission. Raven clarified if Hashi could handle such a job. Hashi replied that it wasn't about the complexity of the mission, but about what needed to be done. Hashi didn't like the fact that his client's wishes required him to eliminate a target he held a terrible grudge against. So he came to Raven to tell him that this was utter nonsense. Raven got angry and said that it was his business to eliminate the target and get a decent reward afterward, and that shouldn't be a problem. Hashi then asked if Raven knew that the client wanted to destroy the wings of creation. Raven replied that it was a funny joke. Then Hashi started shouting that the target was his longtime friend from the time of the game. He is a healer with a kind and friendly disposition, and it is impossible to hold a grudge against such a person. Hashi explained that the only motive for this murder was to hurt the guild of the wings of creation. Raven continued to stare out the window and remained silent. Hashi continued to say that healers are valuable to each guild. They are weak on their own, and if a strong healer dies, it will hurt the organization. Raven laughed and replied that it was nonsense, since why would they want the Dark Guild to kill healers from other guilds? And they had better things to do. Then Hisashi told Raven right to his face that it looks like their occupation is to prevent passing the tests, since currently only the Wings of Creation Guild is able to pass further tests. And once rid of them, no one else will be able to resist further chaos. Hisashi told Raven that he realized that it was far more profitable for their guild if countries were unable to pass the tests. Raven continued to stare out the window and replied that Hisashi was right, of course, and turned around and said that it would be much easier not to prevent the test from passing, but to simply wipe out an entire country. And this will only be possible if the Wings of Creation disappear, and they must be eliminated before a new trial arises. At this time, Raven let his dark threads go and wrapped them around Hisashi's leg. The boy started screaming that this was crazy. Raven replied that it didn't concern him either way, as his life would end here and now. Hisashi didn't understand what Raven was getting at, and in that very second, Raven activated the Shadow Path skill. He bound Hisashi with dark threads and began to squeeze him. However, Hisashi started laughing and shouting for Raven to kill him so that his older brother Yudo would finally be free. Hisashi yelled that if he killed him, Yudo would no longer obey them, since Yudo had been working for them for so long, because of them taking Hisashi hostage. Raven smiled and replied that he would definitely find other leverage on Yudo. However, Hisashi didn't give up and said that there was no way they would be able to subdue Yudo through other means. Raven pulled out and activated his spear, telling Hisashi to think about why he was forbidden to communicate with his brother. Then he stuck a spear in the guy's heart and said his brother wouldn't even know of his agonizing death. And after that, Raven said he was even a little sorry, because if Hisashi hadn't minded his own business, he would have lived a lot longer. Remembering these events, Kuroki told Raven that he had told him that he should have just cut off Hisashi's limbs and crippled him. Kuroki then smiled widely, fixed his mustache, and said that Hisashi would be a good new toy for him. Raven replied that if he left alive someone who knew their plans, there could be a leak and he couldn't let that happen. Kuroki said that if their plan went well and Japan disappeared, he could warm his bones in a fancy resort. He was starting to think about whether to go to Hawaii, the Maldives, or Dubai. The boy Jack laughed and said that the old man already had his old man's plans for his life in his head. Jack also added that lying down at the resort gets boring after a day, but playing with gaudy toys is just the right activity for Kuroki. Kuroki got angry, jumped up, and started yelling that little Jack was yapping a lot today. One of those present tried to calm him down and told him that they could get promoted if they destroyed the country. A place in the head office was assured. Kuroki replied that he wasn't interested in paperwork and would rather be on the front lines. After all, it was more fun to kill people than to sit in a stuffy office. And it's good for your health. Raven listened to each and asked how the trespassers were doing. The girl reported that they had sent soldiers there, but the intruders had managed to overpower them all. Raven got up from his chair and said that it was obvious since Yudo was there, and of course the small mercenaries couldn't match him. He told the girl to tell the boss that they would handle it themselves. After that, Raven took his weapon and said that Kuroki and Jack would go with him. Kuroki was surprised that Raven was so serious. After all, those two rats wouldn't be able to do anything against them. Raven turned around and said not to take rodents lightly, because a cornered rat could chew a cat's neck off. And on top of that, this guy, they know nothing about. So Raven decided to kill him as soon as possible using the most of their powers. Meanwhile, Ray and Yudo were trying to count how many warriors they had put down and how many millions they had made. Yudo said that they'd gotten half of it right. Ray said that was fine, since there was another half to raise money. Suddenly, Raven came out of the tower. Ray noticed that Yudo was getting very nervous and asked what was wrong. Yudo said, and there he was coming out. Raven turned to Yudo and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. And if he'd gotten this far, he already knew the truth about his brother. Fury overcame Yudo. He said that Raven would definitely answer for his little brother's death. Yudo applied the super speed skill. However, the system reported that the super speed skill could not be activated, and the skill rollback time was 3 hours, 25 minutes, and 52 seconds. Yudo was very angry and decided to pounce on Raven and get revenge on him after all. Ray watched from the side and thought that Yudo had completely lost his head. However, he decided to let him do one reckless act today. However, Yudo didn't even have time to fly to Raven. Jack appeared and cut him off using the wide cut skill. Yudo spotted Jack and Kuroki. Jack laughed loudly and said that Yudo was an idiot for coming all this way to be finished off. Kuroki intervened and told Jack that it was rude of him to make fun of Yudo, since such a fool could only be pitied. It was a foolish thing to risk his life for a dead body. Yudo could barely contain his anger and said that Raven had brought Jack and Kuroki with him. Ray asked who they were and said they could be blown up with coins. At that moment, Yudo turned to Raven and demanded that he explain why he had taken his little brother's life. Raven smiled and replied that there was no reason. The rat bit his master's hand and paid for what he had done. Yudo looked at him angrily and asked if he had killed Hisashi because he didn't want to obey him. Raven's aura turned dark, and he asked Yudo that if he was as stupid as his brother that he couldn't realize that useless rodents were supposed to be gotten rid of. Yudo clutched his weapon with all his might and said that Raven would pay for daring to laugh his brother into the dirt. At that moment, Jack and Kuroki surrounded this one, telling Yudo to watch his back or else he'd go after his brother. And suddenly Ray appeared. With a chopping blow of his soul, he disarmed Kuroki and Jack, dropping them to the ground. Ray then looked at Yudo and said that he could go and Ray would deal with those freaks. Yudo thanked Ray and turned his attention to Raven. He wanted to destroy him by any means necessary. However, Raven called him an idiot and asked him how he was going to take his life without his super speed. And after saying that, Raven used the Ice Fortress skill. A wall of ice appeared in front of Yudo. However, Yudo said not to underestimate him. He gathered all his strength, flew to the top, and released a huge amount of energy using the thermal explosion skill. With a powerful punch, Yudo managed to crack the ice wall, and he found himself facing Raven. Ray saw what happened and realized that things were bad. He immediately used a cut and coin blast towards Yudo. There was an explosion, and Yudo was thrown back a few meters. He got his feet and screamed at Ray for why he had done it. Continuing the battle with Kuroki and Jack, Ray said that Yudo would thank him again. He asked Yudo to turn around and see what he had saved him from. Turning around, Yudo saw a huge ice pillar. He realized that if it wasn't for Ray, he would have been under the pillar. Ray shouted to him that he actually charges millions for saving a life, and after the mission, Yudo would have to pay up, and to how he could get revenge if he skates off. Suddenly, Raven turned to Ray and said that this was the first time he was seeing him, and he seemed to be the one who had thwarted their plans with the trial at the European Mansion and Museum. Ray preferred to play dumb and replied that he didn't know what he was talking about, and it wasn't worth it to talk nonsense. But Ray was sure that Raven knew about the Gold Farm Guild, but had no clue about his identity. Raven told Ray that he didn't understand why he would go against a strong organization and mess with a traitor, condemning himself to death. Ray laughed and asked what that was for. For the sake of making more money, of course. Raven was surprised by this response and asked if Ray had really decided to make an entire guild his enemy. Ray started laughing even louder and replied that there was nothing in this world more precious than money, so he was not embarrassed by anything. Ray then said that there was a 1 million yen reward being offered for Raven's head, and besides, if he died, Yudo would work for him for free. At that moment, Ray gathered his energy and told Raven that he had once killed Hisashi for his guild's profit, and now it was time for him to die for Ray's money. And right after those words, Ray used the spiritual limit-breaking skill. The system alerted Yudo that the player Ray wanted to use the skill on him. The system also warned Yudo that this skill required a quick reaction. Yudo needed to press the green key to confirm. The boy agreed. In the same second, the system notified that the spiritual burst skill was activated and the skill rollback time was reduced to 0. Also, for the duration of the skill, Yudo receives protection from the Ray player's powers. Ray looked at Yudo and gave him the command to move forward. Yudo immediately used his super speed and headed towards Raven. Raven got angry and said that it was very cheeky. He didn't expect Yudo to be able to use super speed again. Meanwhile, Yudo was confidently flying towards him. However, in a moment, An ice peak appeared in front of Yudo. Raven applied ice arrows and asked that did Yudo forget that he knew his moves better than anyone else. After saying that, Raven laughed loudly and said that Yudo's speed and sword skills were indeed worthwhile. However, Raven was aware of his 3 weaknesses. And the first weakness is that Yudo only fights at short range. Raven took advantage of this and almost succeeded in destroying him. Yudo was very angry that Raven knew him so well. After all, he thought he was invincible with that attack speed. Meanwhile, Raven said that Yudo's second weakness was his low attack power. And after saying that, he pinned the guy down with his huge spear. Yudo lashed out, but Raven kept saying that Yudo's skill is time-limited, and Raven just needs to survive the time the skill is used, and then he wins. Yudo realized that there was truth in Raven's words, and he was no match for him. But Yudo believed that he too had a chance to win. Raven noticed that Yudo had become pensive and said that he was reading him like an open book, so he shouldn't overthink things. Yudo realized that he too knew Raven's basic advantages and only knew one skill to be wary of. And this skill is a kickback skill. The skill increases the recoil of a blocked attack, and the person can attack with double the force. And due to Ray's power transfer, Yudo's attack power is also increased. Hence Raven's recoil is also increased. Therefore, Yudo made the decision that he should attack until the moment he activated the skill. So he did. Raven was shocked at how this rat had such powerful strength. Yudo was even amused by this. He realized that thanks to Ray's help, he could fight Raven as an equal. Yudo's amusement made Raven angry. He told him not to get cocky. After that, Raven raised his spear and used the kickback skill. The spear stabbed into Yudo's chest with tremendous force. He flew back a few meters and formed a hole in the wall from the impact. Raven smiled widely and said he would let Yudo meet the same death as his brother. And suddenly at that moment, from the back, the knife that Ray had launched at him flew at Raven. Raven noticed in time and managed to dodge. The knife only scratched his cheek and stuck into the wall beside Yudo. Raven got angry and started yelling for Ray to stay out of it, since he was next in line anyway. However, Ray only smiled in response and said that this knife would come in handy for Yudo. Immediately after saying that, Yudo took out a knife from the wall and ran up to Raven, stabbing the knife into his stomach. Raven couldn't understand how it happened, and Yudo said he knew his moves better than anyone, so he had to learn new tricks from Ray. After saying that, Yudo pulled out his knife, and Raven collapsed to the ground. Yudo was victorious in this fight. Yudo looked at all this and cried. He said that he was able to avenge his little brother Hisashi. At that moment, Yudo remembered all the happiest moments of his life when he and his brother were together. After a few seconds, the system notified that the effect of the spiritual limit-breaking skill was over, and Yudo's physical strength returned to normal. An exhausted Yudo collapsed on Ray's shoulder and said that he still wanted to defeat Raven on his own. Ray backed him up and replied that he wasn't much help to him, and Yudo had taken Raven's life on his own. Yudo was very weak. However, he asked Ray what was up with Jack and Kuroki. Ray smiled and replied that the two who came with Raven were lying on the sidelines over there. A couple minutes ago, Ray stood watching Yudo and Raven fight, but Jack and Kuroki wouldn't let him just watch. They approached Ray and began to apply their skills, Jack immediately applying the death aura skill. Ray was even surprised. He knew it was a skill to create a space where the attack power would be increased. Jack then applied a wide cut, and Kuroki applied a piercing charge attack at that moment behind Ray's back. Kuroki laughed evilly and asked Ray how he would be able to dodge without a fulcrum now. Ray had had enough of playing these games. He destroyed Jack with one swipe of his hand, and then went to Kuroki. Ray flew up to him and put a knife to his neck, saying that only an idiot would part with his weapon during a fight. After saying that, he slit his throat. Meanwhile, Yudo told Ray that he instantly took out those mutts. Ray smiled and replied that it wasn't anyone's fault that they had such a huge difference in strength. Yudo was sitting against the wall and couldn't move, so he apologized to Ray and said he couldn't help him anymore. Ray smiled and said that so-and-so would make the money himself. Suddenly, an unknown man appeared in front of them and said that they would have no vacation. He stood with a huge hammer in his hands and turned to Yudo, saying that he never would have thought Yudo could defeat Raven. Behind this man's back were a dozen more soldiers. Ray realized that the reinforcement from the Dark Guild seemed to have arrived faster than the Creation Wings. After saying that, Ray walked over to the man and said with a smile that one person was worth 1,000,000 yen, and there were even more than 20 of them here. Ray's aura shone brightly. At this moment, he was thinking about money, and he liked that this wasn't a dungeon of some kind, but a gold mine. It didn't take a minute before Ray was done with them all. He went up to the man and said that he looked formidable, but in reality, he was a weakling. Ray didn't care, though, because he was going to get his money. And just after those words, a convoy of black cars drove into the tower. Ray said that the Wings of Creation had arrived. He immediately removed the illusionary mask from his face so that there would be no unnecessary questions or suspicions. Sakino came out of the car and told Ray in surprise that he had done a great job here. She then looked around and asked if the two of them had managed to block the Dark Guild's retreat exit. Ray replied that it wasn't particularly difficult. Sakino then asked where his partner was. Ray pointed his finger at Yudo and said that he was lying there. Yudo said that they had somehow miraculously managed to hold out. Sakino replied that it must have been a tough battle. After that, Sakino gave a command to her men and said that from now on, the Wings of Creation would also help in the blockade. One of the members of the Wings of Creation Guild said that the blockade and such complications are unnecessary because all the bad guys are sitting inside and they should just go in and kill them. Another of the guild members also supported the guy and said that the strongest fighters of the guild had come here, and together they would definitely do well. However, Sakino calmed everyone down and said that this operation was commanded by Ray, and disobeying his orders would be punishable. However, the conversations between the guild members did not stop. Then guild member Hoshino intervened. She started yelling for everyone to shut up since Sakino had clearly told everyone to listen to Ray. One of the men told Hoshino not to interfere. However, the girl put him on the spot and asked him that did he really think he could shut her up because she was a woman. Ray intervened and said that their opponent's strength lies in numbers, so one must not act indiscreetly. Also, Ray said that if anyone has any objections, they can speak up, since Ray is not going to cooperate with anyone who doesn't like his ideas, and also he won't be responsible for their lives. He then asked for a show of hands from all those who agreed to his terms. Everyone agreed, but Ray asked that Yudo keep an eye on the two who were initially against it. Ray then gave a clear order for all the captives to be sent to the guild branch. After a while, they all camped there in friendship and cooked a bunch of delicious food. Sakino sat down to eat a marshmallow and said that it had been 3 hours since they had arrived, and the Dark Guild guys were in no hurry to come out. Ray grilled the meat menacingly and said that they must have figured out that reinforcements were coming to them. And this fight is going to endure, but they can't sit here for long, as the food supply will run out at some point. And all they can do is wait. Yudo took a bite of a piece of steak and said that here was some delicious grilled meat they had. Ray clarified that they brought the Creation Wings. Sakino smiled and said that a blockade couldn't be survived without good food and pleasant company. Hoshino supported her and said that they could wait as long as they wanted in comfort. Sakino stood up from her chair, looked up, and said that however their barbecue was coming to an end, as she was notified that 2 suspicious men were approaching them. Ray immediately took off his apron. However, the guild member said again that there was no need to panic, since there were 2 of them, and that meant they were going for reconnaissance, not battle. However, Ray took a bite of meat and replied that when it comes to players, it's quality over quantity that matters. And 2 strong fighters would cause more trouble than 100 weaklings. Ray then turned to Yudo and asked if he had any idea who the 2 people might be. Yudo replied that there were people in the guild far stronger than Raven, codenamed Beta, Gamma, and Alpha. About these people, Yudo only knew their code names and no more information. Sakino then showed Yudo the video that the reconnaissance team had sent her. 2 guys were seen in the video, and Sakino asked if Yudo knew them. However, Yudo replied that he was seeing them for the first time. But given the position of the Dark Guild, Yudo assumed it could very well be Beta and Gamma. Ray realized at this moment that there was one strong player left in the castle, and the other two right now wanted to conduct a takeover of their group. Tsukino, meanwhile, suggested that Ray split up. She would take one player and Ray would take the other. And the others can handle the third. Tsukino assumed that way they could handle 3 times. Yudo warned everyone to be careful, since the only one he'd met of the 3 was Alpha. He was the only player he thought was creepy, even though he'd seen a lot of them before. Ray then turned to Tsukino and said that since the enemy was so strong, the payment would have to be doubled. Tsukino laughed and replied that he was already dreaming. Ray said that if that was the case, he could keep hitting weaklings instead of this. Ray then turned to Yudo and said that he was leaving him in charge here while they were busy with those 2. Tsukino ordered everyone to get ready. They approached the gate, and suddenly a flock of crows flew from the forest. No one realized what was suddenly happening. Tsukino immediately ordered everyone to retreat. A huge red ball appeared at the gate, which swept through the gate and left a huge trail of flames. The guild members began to echo and ask if everyone was alive. It turned out that some were badly injured. No one could understand what kind of destructive force it was. Tsukino ordered that the healers immediately treat all the injured. The same 2 guys were standing at the gate. One said to the other that they were still alive, and maybe we should hit them again. Tsukino shouted to them that they definitely wouldn't fall for it a second time. Yudo said they would fight the 2 of them. However, Tsukino replied that it wouldn't work that way. She flew upwards and applied the Hell Vortex skill. Fireball attacked those 2, and Tsukino said she could handle them on her own. And suddenly the man on the roof said that it was uncivilized to make noise in someone else's house, and even at night. After all, they didn't think at all that they were preventing him from admiring the beautiful full moon. Tsukino was fighting 2 strong players. One of them was surprised that she was that good, and immediately realized that she was the head of the Wings of Creation Guild. Meanwhile, Hashino was fighting the second one. The one was also surprised that they had strong women in their guild. At that moment, Hashino noticed the same man from the roof coming at Tsukino and warned her. He approached Tsukino and said that if it wasn't for that girl, she would have lost her head by now. He asked if all of the 10 excellent ones were such weaklings. And when it comes to monsters, they're certainly good, but they lack experience in real combat. Tsukino got angry and replied that she shouldn't rate 10 excellent since she had plenty of experience in actual combat. Suddenly he flew up and said that she didn't realize that he wasn't talking about experiences against monsters, but battles against humans. At that moment, another flew up. Activating his skill, he released an energy needle at Tsukino and wounded him. She fell to the ground, pulled out the needle, and couldn't understand why everything was swimming in front of her eyes. The system immediately reported that Tsukino's player was under the status of lethal poisoning. The guild healers instantly reacted and used the mass healing skill. However, Tsukino only got worse. The healers couldn't understand what was going on and why it didn't work. One of the enemies laughed loudly and said that there were no healers who could cure her of his poison. Tsukino then raised her weapon up and said that in that case, she would just kill him until the poison spread throughout her body. However, he managed to dodge the fire and began to laugh that her kick was so strong. After all, such fierce attacks would only work against monsters, and there was no point in them if she couldn't hit. Tsukino didn't stop and applied the infernal vortex. The enemy started laughing again and saying that he had already spoken. He ironically asked Tsukino what was the point of her attacks if he was able to dodge them. And at that moment, a guild member attacked him from behind. He applied the Hammer of Destruction skill. The enemy was angry that the jerk had charged at his arm. At this moment, the other guild members appeared and applied the Precision Arrow and Circular Slash skill. Tsukino smiled and said that skills aimed at area attack were only effective against weak and inexperienced targets. And a magic attack with the fire element can disorient the enemy, but he can also easily dodge it. And in such a case, you should use numerical advantage to corner the enemy. Completely exhausted, Tsukino asked that did he really think she was a complete idiot and hadn't prepared for this. Suddenly, Tsukino fell to the ground. The guild members instantly ran over to her. And at this moment, the system reported that due to the death of player Cho Fai Long, the status of fatal poisoning would be removed. Sakino woke up and a team member told her that blinding the enemy with a fire flash was a brilliant idea and her strategy worked. Sakino replied that they had practiced for a reason, and the power of the wings of creation lay not in one person, but in unity. Meanwhile, Yudo was fighting the second one. He used the thermal lunge technique. The enemy told him that he had certainly heard that the rat had betrayed them. However, he did not think he would prove weaker than him. He then assessed the situation and realized that Hoshino was the main threat. Her weapon is a dagger, possible class elite thief. Lives in Musano City. 28 years old, single, former member of a theater troupe. Her physical abilities are on the level of a normal human. She is one of Sakino's closest aides, but she has no combat experience. This was all the information the enemy had about her, yet he couldn't understand why he couldn't even hit her. And as soon as he attacks her, Yudo starts breathing down his back, and they attack him at the same time. The agents didn't tell him she was good at fighting. The enemy decided to gather himself and used his assault blade, and now he had only to shorten the distance. However, at that moment, he was tied up by threads. He couldn't understand how this was possible, since the agent had reported that this skill belonged to Rayendo. Hoshino tied it with golden thread and began to pull it down. Then she used the skill of soul, thread, small flame. The enemy was burned alive. Those around him could not understand how such a thing was even possible. Hoshino then turned to Ray standing behind her and said that he did a great job, all thanks to him. Ray put his hand over his heart and said that he shouldn't be grateful. After all, she did a great job. The guild members were shocked and couldn't understand what was even going on.